All right. All right. Welcome, everybody. We're getting started on what is this, our third, fourth, fifth session? Fifth session on what is called thinking, second to last. We're reading in sections 6 through 8 of part 2, which is the last but 3 sections of the book. We're into the interpretation of a Parmenides saying, usually translated as needful it is both to say and to think being is, or one should both say and think that being is, as our translation has it. But anyway, that's the traditional translation. Obviously, Heidegger's going to give us a new translation, skewed towards his own stuff. Anyway, that's where we are. This session is going to cover everything up to the last 2 words. So he's going to be working on translating it down through the thinking word, the Noen word. But the last 2 words, the eon emmenai, the being is, parts of translated being is, he will not really have gotten to yet, and that's that and the wrap up of what he thinks the Greeks heard or meant by being, and a whole wrap up interpretation of the whole thing and relating it to history of philosophy, of Western philosophy, etc., will be the last little bit of the book. Anyway, that's where we're headed. The what is called thinking part. The thinking part is probably most emphasized here. That the fact that thinking deserves the name, something like that, is about being, will be the subject matter of the last part. I want to just quickly talk about scheduling that last part. I would like to do it on the October 29th. That's the last Sunday in October. Is that going to work for people? I get a nod from Joe. Can we visit this end? Okay, from Pete. Dan seems okay. Craig is good. Okay, so we'll preliminarily schedule it for the 29th of October. That's going to be just the balance of the book as I'm reading, and wrap up thoughts on it, etc. Because we are wrapping up, I'm also open to people's suggestions about what they want to do next. We could maybe get to that toward the end. I got some of my own ideas on this, some more ambitious, some less. I want to give people a chance to weigh in about whether or not they want to continue to go big or whether or not they want to go home. Anything like that. All right, so anyway, that's my just preliminary administrative stuff out of the way, so we can get to do the reading kind of stuff and past experiences with any of this material and first impressions. Pete, you want to start us off?
Sure. I got through the reading twice. My impressions is, he's on his path, and where he's going it's kind of reminded me of the Anaximander one we did, I think last year, where by the end of it, every word has been changed around from the common understanding of the word to a special understanding. But that said, I thought chapter 7 gave one of the best explanations of this fragment, having read Kirk and others over the years. Even before he gets into his interpretation, he does a really good job of breaking down the sentence and pointing out that this is not a normal sentence. You wouldn't just throw the word being in so many times. It's not a straightforward explanatory or nominative sentence. You're going to have to put on your poet's hat at some point to interpret it. And I also like when he gets into the it happens, like it rains. So you remove the subject controlling everything, traditional sense of Western philosophy and metaphysics, and pushing for that impersonal happening. So that's something I always appreciate. I think that's one of Heidegger's original things, I think, and I always appreciate it when he goes down that path. In other places, he gets more into the Greek because the Greek had tenses of sentences that we no longer have in modern languages, where the certainty is ambiguous or the subject is ambiguous. So I like that aspect of it. Yeah, so that's it for first impressions.
Okay, are there any, I mean, you bring up a few things that we definitely want to talk about in terms of like the impersonal happening idea, and then the degree to which he's making a non-standard translation for every possible word. And but are there other things you want us to stress or get to when we cover these three?
Well, yeah, so with the legging is gathering, I was reading some essays by Derrida, and he says, well, if you have gathering, it's because everything's already dispersed.
Mhm.
So there's a dialectic there.
So I'm going to point out something here. I mean, you're right that often he does interpret Lagan, especially as gathering. Here, it's this letting lie before business. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not the gathering that he stressed in the early Greek thinking stuff where it was a very similar thing, but it was not in the Parmenides there. It was on the Heraclitus, but he stressed the gathering part. He mentions gathering here almost only in passing, and he's got all the emphasis instead on this letting lie before. But I do want to talk about both those senses and maybe bring up the if language gathers, what is it that it gathers, and how does it gather?
Right, and the laying is good, and English is good in that for laying, because we have laying it on the line and laying out a plan and stuff. So there's an affinity there with the German, but yeah. So the Lagan was interesting because of course, as he says, it's the logos and it's the saying, blah, and then before it was about gathering together. Now it's about laying out before one, or it's laid out before one. So I like that part, and also the opposite, the scattering. And Derrida makes the point that this is one of the critiques of traditional metaphysics, which assumes that you can gather everything before you and then make a decision if you were immortal. And Heidegger's point is, no, you're finite. You're never going to get everything, but you still have to make decisions based on what you know.
Now we've gotten reference not only to Derrida, but to two of Parmenides' ways. There's the way of the divine and the way of the mortals, which we'll have to get to. Okay, yeah. So that's fine. We definitely want to talk about the various senses of logos here, and how many of them are Heidegger's importation, and how many of them are Parmenides's in the phrase itself. Craig, first impressions.
First impression was the first part. I started feeling like Heidegger was starting to waffle again, and go around in circles. So I was starting to get a little disappointed at that point, but kind of as Pete indicated, he picked it up in the next two sections. And I thought he did a masterful job of sorting out what things we have in our tradition that Parmenides never had, because Parmenides was prior to that tradition. And so he would not have any of that kind of layering that we've added on since then. And I came away at the end with feeling like he'd really done a masterful job of deciphering at least the first parts of this, and we'll get to the last two words afterwards. But I thought the deciphering and placing it back into literally Parmenides' time was great. The two little takeaways that I'll just throw in there as incidentals. I want to go back and read Peter Kingsley's work on Parmenides now that I have a different view of it. And secondly, I've got to get into the Holderman's Pindar about his comments about centaurs. I found that kind of fascinating. So I've got to see exactly what he was trying to say there.
Yes, we might have to talk a little about how Holderlin comes into all this. On the part about the initial waffling, I mean, this is one of the things that that Heidegger often does, which is that he anticipates possible objections from the crowd, and then he enunciates those objections in a way that may look like he's like losing the plot, but he's really just imagining a student or a contemporary thinker having a certain reaction to them and stating that objection and then addressing that objection. And that's definitely what he's doing at the start of 6, where he's sort of saying, you know, what is this, completely trivial, vacuous statement that a thinker supposedly the way to Parmenides is saying, and that's he's clearly, put on his, audience straw man hat to have those objections, and then he's going to try to address those objections. It's still instructive to go through that and ask, what does Heidegger imagine Parmenides might have to be embarrassed about before that audience member, something like that, and what standards are being applied to it. And but this brings in the rain rains and the as well as the tree. We have to ask if the rain raining or the being of the tree actually get to what Parmenides was getting to when he's saying that this is a necessity and being is. But anyway, so but yeah, that early part, I do want to talk a fair about when we get to exposition about that early part, because it is one of these multi-voice things of you have to track where he's speaking the imaginary objection and where he's making his objections to objections, and then when he's gotten back to his original exposition, etc. That doesn't mean that in all those switches around, Parmenides himself has necessarily always gotten full justice, if I can put it that way, because it's a debate with an imaginary audience member that also lives inside Heidegger, right? Because Heidegger has that part of himself too. It's just a modern person with those modern sensibilities. But okay, fine. Dan, you want to give us your first reactions?
Sure. So I read the three chapters, and as it happened, I was these days for 2-3 weeks. I'm reading on Inception. It's a new translation, and I think I'm mixing stuff already, like what's he saying there and what he's saying here. And I guess one thing that it's how deep he goes there on Inception, and how cautious he is here in laying things out. Like he goes stage by stage, and as you said, like anticipating objections and preparing the ground, and he's very cautious and moving very slowly to make his case. And one thing that I think for me is very, very deep and interests me a lot here is like thinking, like to understand thinking, like making present, like, and this kind of logos, like telling and laying out, and it's kind of like it's the original meaning, and how everything kind of we moderns take it for logic, and how simple and impoverished that view is, but also efficient and powerful in a way. And yeah, it's that those are kind of my first impressions.
Okay, well, definitely want to talk about the language as enunciating the gathering stuff. We talked about the meanings of Legastai, et cetera, Lagan here. But we do want to relate some of it to the modern stuff, and to the logic stuff. He brings up logic like occasionally in passing here, but usually always it's just like a bare bow to the term, if I can put it that way, and its modern meaning. I think there may be a little bit more connection to Parmenides there. That is, Parmenides is trying to say something about something like a kind of necessity that we recognize as a kind of logical necessity. And I want to talk through a little bit about what that the history of all that is. And I think that this is also related to the him potentially being embarrassed on an audience member's behalf that a thinker of the stature of Parmenides would enunciate a tautology, as though that is a faux pas. And we want to talk about why he thinks that would be a faux pas. But anyway, and that's related to these questions about is logic as vacuous is sometimes presented. Christian, first impressions.
Can you guys hear me all right?
Yep. coming through.
Okay. Yeah, so I did do the reading, and yeah, my first impression was I agree with what you and Dan have said, that and Craig too, I think that there does almost seem to be a lot of jumping around in this book. But it's interesting because he did tie it back to some of the things that he said earlier. These three sections have been sort of an exercise in translation, and he's even sort of philosophizing about translation itself. And yeah, this whole work so far, what's really struck me is the way that Heidegger is digging back into the past and digging deep into the sort of endless wellspring of meaning that you find in language. And yeah, I need to go back and reread some of the previous sections, I think, to really get it. But I enjoyed it a lot, and I expect that he's going to tie it all together probably in the next sections. So I'm looking forward to that.
He will definitely have some tying together, but he will also tell you at one point that he's doing this as just a leap into a single vision. He's not going to lay out every step that got him there. He's just going to show you, this is what I can see that to me ties it all together. And it's like he's almost going to apologize and say, and I cannot show you why, right? I cannot show you all the ways that I got there because we don't have time. Because as usual with Heidegger, as he gets to the end of a lecture, he's running out of time, or lecture series in this case. But yeah, so there is a lot of mining of the deep meaning in words and delving into history. But one of the other things to be, if we put it this way, critically aware of as we're reading him is how much of these, deep echoes and meanings there in the words are things which Heidegger sees and hears because he's relating this saying of Parmenides to other things he knows about Greek, or other things he's run into in Greek, and how much of it is put there by Heidegger in that sense, and how much of it was put there by Parmenides. Is Parmenides expecting every native Greek speaker off the street to understand what he is saying when he says this line, with all of the various overtones and weights that Heidegger you're putting on it? Or would the average Greek speaker with full command of the nuances of the language, but none of the philosophical depth that Parmenides is bringing to it, have heard any of this, right? How much of it is it language and how much of it is philosophy is those things that I'm getting at. How much of it is that there's a distance between Greek language and us, or there's a distance between the topics that Parmenides is thinking about and the way he is thinking about them, and anybody in any language. And Heidegger can often, especially in this stage of Heidegger, can often make it seem like if we could just hear in Greek, we would understand what all of these thinkers have thought and poets have sung and all that sort of thing, right? I doubt that everyone who was a native speaker of Greek then did hear all of that. So we have to be cautious about how much of this is nuances language and how much of it is compacted meanings that advanced thinkers pack into their freighted phrases, so to speak. And there's a related risk in that second part, which is that some of those freighted meanings may be discovered there by a later thinker, even though they weren't put there by the first one. Anyway, so those are some of the live issues for me as I'm reading this, because I mean, I always have to give Heidegger his head and let him go where he's going to go and show you all the things he can see in these words. But then you always have to ask yourself, were all of those things in that reading that we just got put there by Parmenides, or is this more Heidegger and less Parmenides? And was Parmenides also saying something else that Heidegger maybe hasn't translated? But we'll get to that when we get to going over the didactic portion, if I put it that way. But this is good. Joe, first reactions?
Yes. First, I have to say that I thank you very much for recording these sessions. I get more out of them when I watch them a second time. I spent them this morning before now watching the YouTube channel from last time. And the best benefit is that they provide subtitles. They try to translate it into characters. And so that compensates for my gaps in attention span and also gaps in understanding through my ears. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm interested, I was especially struck by the fact that he substituted at one point the idea that it is useful, in contrast to the first thing we encountered called necessary. Yes. In the doggerel from Parmenides. And that focused my mind because when you say something is useful, you're talking about human willfulness, and that brings in the will claim that you did mention last time. And I think that's very important because when one is thinking, I think one is not simply contemplating one's navel or doing totally in the mind abstract philosophical speculation. But most of the time when you're thinking, you're trying to relate the extant things around you to some goal that you formulated and are trying to possibly contemplate and visualize because you're, I'm a man of action. And so I want to think about these things in terms of, the usefulness and how they work for me. And so that struck me, made me more pensive about what we're talking about here. I'm still a little bit over my head. Mm-hmm. And so I'm delighted to hear these lectures and particularly to watch the subsequent recordings of them with subtitles.
Great. So good for bringing up the useful translation. It is definitely one of the more put it this way, original things here, and not many people would have seen useful as the proper translation of Cree at the beginning of this line. And he is definitely seeing something there. Is the purposes that he sees in that simply human purposes? Not simply. He's getting at some notion of useful that he thinks that things have that is something like an appropriate to them, which is something like a in their nature or power. There's a telos in things that is what they're for, and there is a what they're for of saying and thinking, of letting lie before and taking to heart. And this gets to this notion that you get in the Greeks of nature is not simply there for us to use or ignore for our purposes, but is a standard. It's providing a set of directions of appropriatenesses, and Heidegger is seeing echoes of that in some of the Hölderlin poetry that he's citing here, some of the romantics early at the stages of early German idealism, which is what Hölderlin is contemporary with. So yes, it's striking that he does translate the start of the line that way. It's relating to these. Is there a natural telos in things for what they're good for? Is that their natures? There's a relating this all back to a the whole practical equipmental context or understanding of early Heidegger that's kind of being echoed here a little bit. But the purposes are not simply a for human purposes like you would get in early Heidegger, where the meanings of things shine through our possible interactions with them or something like that. There's more of a something called for here. He's getting back to this calling notion. Okay, and one of the reasons this matters is this is one of the most pushed parts of the translation, if I can put it that way. Parmenides may mean something much closer to needful, and he may need that needful to have the connotation of proper use. That's useful, not just, but with a proper added. But also something closer to necessary. And we'll talk about the different meanings of the word at the beginning of the line and where it fits in the whole Parmenides poem when we get to the didactic part. But yes, we definitely have to pay attention to what he means by useful here and why he's pushing it in that direction and away from the necessary that is the traditional interpretation. Okay, but fine question. So is it Isabel? Want to join us? If you don't know format, we typically go around and ask people if they had a chance to do the readings and if they encountered this stuff before, and then first impressions to the reading. Oh, this is Isabel. I'm sorry. Of course you know our format. You're just on mute.
I have a new computer.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. anyway, because the other one went on the blink. So what happened? Yes, I was going to say, Jason, I almost think it's too long because I did all the reading way at the beginning of the month and I loved every single part of it. But unfortunately, I can't get this thing going. But unfortunately, I forget, and I remember how much I loved it, especially the last lecture, number 8. Yeah, 8, absolutely. And I totally related to the translation. I love that part when he talks about the translation because having translated myself, I know it is so important to know where the language and the culture and the background of where the term comes from, and then what you do is you lift that. I don't know how you have to lift it, and then you have to go to the culture you are translating into, so that you may translate as accurately as possible. So you have to know 2 cultures. And but I'll tell you one thing, once you do translate, especially a difficult term, and you find un inquadramento fits just right, you jump for joy, because to see such fitting, it's as if it's almost like a eureka moment when you find you're able to make the connection. So anyway, and I was unhappy that I was not able to look at the past recording to refresh my memory. But anyway, I am happy to be here and eager to hear what else is.
I read these 3 chapters, and then I reread them again to prepare for this meeting this morning. I really got it gave me some, the ideas are kind of coming together, connecting his notion of perhaps being with Parmenides, and Parmenides thinking about, necessity and usefulness. So it's kind of like bringing the ideas of Parmenides, a sense of oneness of being, with what he means by, thinking, needfulness, usefulness, and what being is, right? So yeah, I was impressed by his ideas of usefulness that he talks about in terms of how humans are naturally, behaving, thinking usefully, but it's also going on in the world, right? It rains, the rain rains, and so forth, and things happen in nature that are also useful. And so that kind of gave me a sense that there is this kind of not just human beings as beings, but there is a being in a wider sense of beyond us. So I guess that's the illusion that he's making through Parmenides. And
so that a couple things. I mean, some of this may be from Parmenides, some of it may be from the Holderlin he's referring to, some of it in pointing out things that the languager is saying himself. But yes, he has this notion of the impersonal happening that Pete was talking about, and he's kind of, besides just the impersonal happening of the il y a, right, and is the construction in French, right? There it's just a passive there is of some ongoing happening, something like that. But independent of that, when he's talking about the useful, he's trying to get at this notion that there's something about appropriate responding human action, which is responding to a standard that it is receiving from the things themselves, and the things or the activities themselves. And he's packing that into the it is useful with the impersonal use, right? So what's the connection between them, right? There's a notion that it's not a matter of it was useful for me that I, right, but that it is useful in general in the same way that it rains. So the it rains is not something that is happening for me, right? And the it is useful that he is hearing at the start of this line is not something which is happening for Parmenides, right? That's kind of the claim. So the needful is at the beginning of it is it's not a piece of advice for mountaineers. It's not a piece of advice for sailors. It's not directed at a particular human activity in order for it to flourish. It's saying something more like, this should be, right? This should occur. This is the appropriate, something like that.
Right.
So that's the connection between this impersonal happening notion and this the it is useful with it, that where that it is a kind of passive construction of outside of us. Does that make sense?
Right. So his point is he wants to diminish the idea of subjectivity, right? It's not all. Everything is not subjective. It's not for us, but things happen in nature, and maybe that's what he means when in the last chapter, chapter 8, when he talks about things are lying there for not necessarily for us, but they're just there for
Yeah, the laying things out of what lies before, something like that, is a noticing of a truth that is not put there by us. This is all being contrasted with the notion of sort of a nominalist or constructivist, version of we got a little allusion to it back in the Schopenhauer thing back in way back in part 1. The question of are all the beings projections for our purposes, kind of stuff. That's sort of what he's contrasting all this with, if that makes sense.
Is he saying that thinking is motivated by this kind of being, Parmenides kind of view of being as coming from the wholeness of being itself?
He hasn't brought in Parmenides' sense of being yet, and he hasn't brought up one anywhere in it, Parmenides or otherwise. But he's just paying attention to this creed, this useful, needful, necessary at the start of the line, and he's asking needful in for whom, in what sense, and he's hearing a outside of particular human purposes. It's not like this is what you need to do in order to build a better widget. This is what you need to do in order to understand my logical construction. It's just this is needful. This should be. This is appropriate. And there's an outside and prior call in that Heidegger is underlining.
Of thinking is not just from within.
I'm sorry, you're getting hard to hear, James?
So the calling of thinking is not just from within the subject.
Correct.
It is sort of so it's more complicated than just that subject.
I mean, in the original poem, right? He's been drawn by the by a chariot over through the gates of the portal before the goddess of truth, who is explaining to him the ways of the divine, the ways of mortals, and the way of the altogether not, which I adjure you not to take, right? And what is pronouncing this needful to him is truth. Truth is talking to him, and truth is telling him what is needful. That's the didactic poem's, construction. So I don't know if that helps, but when the thing saying needful in this almost passive way is a goddess and is truth, it's different from this is how to build a better boat. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, thanks.
Great. Okay.
Thanks.
All right, Elaine, first impressions.
I have no idea what's going on, not having been at any of the previous meetings. So my question was, is there a way to access them?
Yes, so we put up recordings of all of our previous meetings on my YouTube channel, which is just my name, Jason Cawley, on YouTube. And sometimes it helps if you put in a search term like Heidegger or the particular book we're reading. These typically go up after later in the same night or the next day, each of our sessions. I usually put a link to each of them at the bottom of the meetup page for that particular activity, although it comes in only after that activity is in the past, so you sometimes have to fish around for it on Meetup. But once you find my YouTube channel, you'll find them all there, and they're organized into playlists and everything. And there's hours and hours of content there, so you can feel free to go back and go through and watch any of those you want. that's a good way to keep up to speed. We announce what our readings are each time and for the next one, and that's also listed on the meetup site. In this case, we're reading this book together, and we're about, I don't know, 3/4 of the way through at the moment. So that's why we're talking about these things that may, what's the context for this? Well, the answer is we're all reading this book together and we're halfway through the second part. So we're all talking about the section that we were assigned to read for this meetup. Does that help?
I just ordered the book. Hopefully it will get here today and I'll start reading since I have a lot to catch up with.
Fair. We're going to do one more session on this book in late October. It'll be the 29th of October, the last 3 sections of the book, if that's enough time. And then we'll be reading something else after that we'll be deciding towards the end of this meeting or next meeting. And there we'll all be starting fresh. And so may help to jump in at the same time with all of us, although it depends on how much background the thing we pick needs. But welcome.
What kind of things have you discussed previously?
Well, we've done several works of Heidegger, several works of Plato. We've done some other things on history of philosophy, being in some philosophers, and so forth. But it's all philosophy stuff. But that's that's the general general remit.
Well, that's fine. I love philosophy, and I was thinking about Plato, but you've already done that.
Well, we've done some Plato, but we'll do it again. I mean, there's lots of Plato. I think the last one we did together was the Theaetetus, and we did that in part because Heidegger was talking about it in one of his essays. So we went off and read the Theaetetus for 3 sessions. We may go back and do that again. One of the things we were talking about as possible for next time would be to read the Plato's Sophists together, but we'll see.
I was thinking about the Republic as compared to what things are like in reality today.
Yeah, well, we might read the Republic together. We talked about it, but it would take us a year, and we have to ask if people want to. It's a big book, but fair. All right, well, thanks for your interest.
Thank you. I'm glad I found you.
Great. Okay. Bruce, do you want to give us your first impressions? I see you're on a phone, so I don't know if it's easy for you, but.
Sorry. No, I'm just listening, so I'm just gonna lurk in the background if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all. That's fine, and do feel free to ask questions if it helps you at some point.
All
right.
I will.
Okay, great. And I also see that Sean also just wants to listen, so that's fine. You want to ask him. Jason, there's my namesake, Jason Benton. You want to have first impressions?
Oh yeah. Well, my problem has been I read too much Heidegger and I read Parmenides or Greek philosophy, and I can't separate these ideas. With Parmenides, you have this concept of the one, and I always assume Heidegger uses that to get back to some idea of the unification of meaning. And I'm yet to find where he makes those connections. I don't know.
Okay, we're having a little bit of audio trouble. Jason, we're having a little bit of audio trouble hearing you. I think you were talking about trying to get back to what Parmenides means by the one as something like a unity of meaning, if that's what he means by it, and trying to see if Heidegger is connecting to any of that. Is that what you were asking?
Yes, that'd be good. Yes.
Okay. I mean, it's fair to say that there's plenty of that stuff in Parmenides, and you'll get some of that talked about in something like Plato's Dialogue, the Parmenides, where you'll also get a lot of other strange dialectical stuff that's very contradictory, aporeic, whatever, of this sort of involved logical argument. And you'll get assessments of those sorts of things in Parmenides from later philosophers in the Platonic tradition, like Plotinus, for example, who will try to explain those sorts of questions that you're directly asking about. And if you wanted to just get someone tell me what Parmenides is saying about that, I can recommend either just a modern secondary source on Parmenides, or you can go see what Plotinus talks about when he talks about Parmenides. Heidegger here is primarily thinking about this particular place in Parmenides as an example of thinking, and as a place where some of the founding decisions of modern, well, not modern, of Western metaphysics sort of get laid. So he's got his own reasons that he wants to stress this, and they're not necessarily Parmenides' own reasons. He's not just trying to, explain Parmenides' philosophy to us. He's got his own Heidegger's own thesis of what role Parmenides played in some of the founding decisions of Western philosophy that Heidegger is trying to locate. And so he's like on that mission, and his Heidegger's own problem from back to early days has all been, what do people mean by being, and what is the meaning of being, and how has this changed through history, and so forth. And so he's always steering towards, what did the Greek philosophers specifically understand by being, think about when they said being, how do they think about the problem of being, and that's just sort of Heidegger's own problem. And we all sort of know if he's talking about one of these guys, he's going to be sort of steering in that direction. And he's picked out this saying of Parmenides because it's about this being is claim, and it's also telling us something about the nature of thinking. So when Heidegger is trying to tell us something about the nature of thinking and relate it to thinking about being, he thinks of this line. So it's as much what sparks are generated in Heidegger's mind from this saying of Parmenides as just trying to be expository about what Parmenides thinks of things. And that does have its limitations. Sometimes we have to go back and ask, what does Parmenides think of all these things themselves? Less, what is Heidegger getting out of them? But we also have to sort of give Heidegger his head in horse riding sense and let him, take us where he wants to go and show us what he can show us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but at some point, Heidegger does argue that being is meaning, late in his later work.
Being as meaning is actually quite there in kind of his early work. What we're going to get at the end of this one is he's going to claim that for the Greeks, being meant something like being present or presentness or something like that. But we'll get that in our next session. We'll get that in our next session when he gets to his interpretation of the last two words of the line. But meaning isn't the term being applied here. There's a lot of talk about what meaning means, so to speak, in being in time. If you want to look for a place in Heidegger where meaning specifically is the topic, I would steer you to the sections of being in time about that. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I'm aware.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm aware of it. I know. I think what he's trying to do is talk about how the metaphysics of Western metaphysics develops. Is that correct?
Yes, and his own thesis about that. I mean, he'll mention late. He's already mentioned several places along things about modern technology. He'll mention places about Hegel's understanding, and he's mentioned places about Kant's understanding. We spent the second half of book one here on Nietzsche as sort of meant to be a stand-in for metaphysics before Heidegger and where Western metaphysics something like ends. And Heidegger is trying to, if I put it this way, explain or contrast that with where it begins, right? He's trying to point out this metaphysics of the formation as something that begins with Parmenides and ends with Nietzsche, something like that. But that means that the beginning and the end have to have something in common because they're part of the same formation, but they're also different, right? Parmenides is not Nietzsche. There's things there in the first beginning with Parmenides that are not remotely still there in Nietzsche. That's just the trajectory of the whole book. We started by going through a bunch of Nietzsche and Heidegger's objections to Nietzsche in order to sort of situate Nietzsche at the end of metaphysics. And then that raised the question of, okay, if we have some distance on metaphysics as a historical thing, right? How do we think about it? And how do we, how do we think about it? And the Parmenides, we're wrestling with the Parmenides here because it's meant to be our way of, if I can put it this way, internalizing and understanding that tradition as something that we are still living inside of, or we are still a part of. That's the overall claim of the book.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. So this was all good first impressions and good things to focus on. I want to get to some of my didactic pieces. I want to start with some of the stuff of the early six. I think several people called this out. Craig, particularly, if it's looking like waffling, where he's got the imaginary objection from the audience member of, is a thinker of the weight, depth, and reputation of Parmenides actually regaling us with the statements as simple as that being is, and isn't this just like rain rains, and isn't it just tautology, and isn't that embarrassing? Okay, and he's putting this objection there to shoot it down because he wants to, he wants people to not be so dismissive of Parmenides they can't hear him, obviously, and so this means he's going to read a bunch more into this saying in Parmenides so that people aren't so likely to rapidly dismiss it. And that may be part of why, as Pete says, by the end of this, you'll have, found a new meaning for every term there. So the traditional meaning will have evaporated. But traditional reading probably had at least some reason for being there in the first place. We might want to pay at least a little bit of attention to it. But I think it's also helpful here to pay attention to what Heidegger sees as the imaginary objections, right? Why would it be embarrassing for Parmenides to say being is if the first thing that leaps into the person's thought like that is that's an empty tautology, that doesn't say anything, that's like saying rain rains. Does it matter if the statement is vacuous if it's true? What is the demand behind? Imagine the audience member's objection and see if you can formulate it as a maxim and generalize it. I generalize it something like the following. Nobody should tell me anything, even if it's true, unless it's news to me, unless I didn't already know it. It is incumbent upon all speakers to bring me new information, and unless they're saying something that I cannot know myself and do not already know myself, the fact that it is true is not of any interest. It has to be saying something that's news to me, right? It has to be newsworthy, entertaining, and it has to be something I wouldn't have thought of myself. It has to be something that doesn't wear its truth on its face. It isn't obviously true, but is only true for some complicated, obscure reason about which I have to be informed by the speaker. That's the way I would formulate what he imagines the demand is. Is there anything sensible in that demand? Do we make that demand of mathematicians? Is a mathematician allowed to tell you something that follows necessarily from the things he said before?
Excuse me, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Jason, I think that is absolutely makes sense. Absolutely. In fact, I think that's what's the problem with our society today, in that if we look at our TikTok and our Twitter, whatever, we screen. If it's not new, if it's not something I haven't heard, get away, get done with it, go down with it. We have no use for something that has been said or thought or enunciated. We want something new. I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, and that's kind of the objection that's here. I entirely agree with you that it's a shallow demand, but Heidegger is not pointing out this demand is shallow. He's bringing up the rain rains example, and we'll see how parallel that actually is. But I agree with you. This is the kind of demand that Heidegger is very good at, denouncing in other contexts, right? As heedless, as demanding, as not willing to stop and listen, and so forth. But he doesn't simply say that here. He wants to say that that Parmenides is saying something more complicated than a tautology, as though there's something embarrassing about tautologies, right? Plain tautologies like rain rains. Let's consider that one for a second because it's brought up as one of the examples here. So yesterday, if I had said rain rains, it might have been somewhat similar to the being is that we get in Parmenides. But if I say it today, at least where I am, it's not the same at all. It's not raining. So it might be true whenever it's raining that what is raining is the rain, and that rain rains whenever it's raining. But it's inside of a hypothetical because raining is not necessary. This is not the same thing Parmenides is saying. Parmenides is saying being is, and he's putting a necessary or needful or some word like that at the start of the line. And he doesn't think that's as contingent as it raining. So the issue here is not whether or not the content follows from the term. There's a necessity in being is, which isn't as hypothetical even as rain rains, because rain rains is only true when it's raining, but it's always being. So there's a kind of necessity here that Parmenides is alluding to, which is not simply the term entailing necessity, if I can put it that way, of rain rains. Okay. So that's the first point, that there's something more here than just rain rains. Question, Isabel? Or there's just thumbs up from Isabel. Okay. The next, question from James.
Yeah, so it's the point that we're missing out on what is right? Is in a sense in our modern terminology, we are used to the habit of seeing things that are constantly new and in process of change, and that we never see anything that is stable and enduring. So he's talking about enduring, the kind of the being of enduring, as opposed to the constant process of becoming and change.
Possibly. I mean, what we're seeing in Parmenides himself is he's distinguishing between the necessity of the being is and the instability and unreliability of opinion. But the opinion that he contrasts, Parmenides contrasts with the necessity of the being is what he calls the way of mortals, in which there is no firm reliance on truth. And he diagnoses that way as being where they treat being and not being as the same and not the same. This is a part of Parmenides' discussion of this that Heidegger has not brought in, focused on at all. He does mention it in some other places. But there's a claim in Parmenides that there's a difference between the way of being in which being is and the way of mortals in which being and not being is the same and not the same. And that the former has this kind of needful and necessity to it, and the latter does not. So that's the contrast that there is in Parmenides himself, and that's not it's not simply being becoming. It's what does being mean? Is being the thing which has to be in the way of the gods, or is being the thing which is just a way of saying the same and not the same in the way of mortals, the way of opinion? Okay.
So it's a difference between positing the truth of what is appearance, as opposed to what is underlying.
So Plato,
right? Yeah.
Plato, as the philosopher of appearance, is the person who interprets this as being all about appearance versus something behind the appearance. Yes, but that's Plato after Parmenides that decides that, yes, I understood this distinction between the realm of being and the realm of opinion that Parmenides lays out, and I'm going to explain it as the realm of opinion is the realm of appearance. That's the way that Plato is going to react to it. But it's not clear that that's already there in Parmenides, because Plato wants to be able to reason with a kind of necessity about things where he does treat being and not being as the same and not the same. He wants to have conceptual thinking, have something like the reliability of the being is path of Parmenides. And that's not what Parmenides says. From Parmenides' point of view, everything Plato is doing with his whole realm of appearance and his whole realm of ideas is the way of opinion. It's the way of mortals. It treats being and not being as the same and not the same. It treats being as a matter of conceptual content, if I can put it that way, right? Whereas, according to Parmenides, the necessity with which being is exceeds any merely logical necessity. It's not simply a logical necessity that being is. It is a prior ontological necessity. So this is all the people who make much about tautologies later are trying to say something like, if something follows from the terms, you're only talking about the terms, you're not talking about the reality behind the terms, something like that. They're worried that if their concept net doesn't have room for the world to disrupt it, that it cannot refer to something actually out in the world. If you're thinking like a Karl Popper or something, who's trying to distinguish between math perhaps and physics perhaps, but it's not necessarily written anywhere that philosophers aren't allowed to be mathematicians from time to time, and they have to always be experimental physicists who are going out and reporting observations to you that might report things to you that are true, that are also necessarily true, and that follow from logic. Fine. Aristotle certainly does, and the entire prior analytics, right? He doesn't claim that any of the things he's saying there don't aren't almost tautological, but writes a whole book about it and founds logic on it and so on, right? So if logic is a part of philosophy, then you can say things which are almost tautological, which still count as philosophy and still count as important and still count as true. It's the first point. But Parmenides is claiming something more than even that logical necessity here for the necessity with which being is. He's not saying rain rains. He didn't write a line about rain rains. He wrote a line about eon emmenai. Okay. The other one that example that Heidegger gives you here is the tree, right? And we'll come back to the blossoming tree and all the things we say about the blossoming tree. And we saw the same tree back in part 1, and that when you're out touching grass and you're standing before a tree, the tree is a being, and the tree is not just an idea in your heads. The tree is not your concept notes about it, but it actually is a being, and it's there. The confrontation between you and it, you and the tree happens, and it happens on the earth, right? Okay, so he's going to give you a sense of being, which is going to try to anchor in that reality prior to your concept nets, reality prior to your terms, reality prior to your logic, if I put it that way. And I think he's right about that. But notice that anchoring into he's doing there, he's trying to do to a particular experience, right? Parmenides is not simply doing it to a particular experience because Parmenides doesn't tell you this eon emmenai line about a tree. He tells it to you about being, which has this very abstract feel. It has this very terminological feel, but he doesn't mean by it the term. He means by it the thing to which the term refers. Okay, so yes, the tree is a being prior to your ideas about the tree, but the tree as a being is not being. There is something contingent about the tree that isn't contingent about being to Parmenides. You don't have to be in front of the tree, right? Tomorrow you might not be in front of that tree. The tree might be torn down tomorrow, right? Whatever. Heidegger will insist to you that still the meeting occurred. He mentions the man who may die under hands tomorrow back when we talked about the tree, right? So there's going to be a being of that as a historical happening, even if it's contingent as to time. Fine. But the necessity with which being is not the same thing as the underlyingness of the being of the tree as being a being prior to our concepts about it. Parmenides is not necessarily disagreeing with that, but he's focusing on something else. There's something needful and necessary about the being is, which is more than a logical necessity, and it's more than an empirical contingency. It is a necessity tout court, completely. Okay, this is why this reading of the first word of the line matters, because it's if what Parmenides is doing here is stressing how the eon emmenai is different from all other propositions, and the dimension in which it is different is how needful it is that needful just something like how man should appropriately enunciate the truth? You could have a need to appropriately enunciate the truth about your confrontation with the tree in bloom, right? There's a needful there too. But that's still a more contingent happening than the eon emmenai to Parmenides. So I don't think that Heidegger really brings this out about what Parmenides is fixated on about the eon emmenai, different from the other propositions. And he may be a little bit too afraid of how tautological it is. Okay. I'm going to give people a chance to react to that. I have a place I want to take it that goes a little bit further to talk about the history of some of this and what happens with it in later history in ancient times and in later history of it in early modern times. I'm thinking of Kant or modern times. But I want to give people a chance to react to any of this needfulness of the particular tautology that Parmenides thinks he's enunciating.
Yeah, so I'll go. So to see if I've got this right. So in the sense of rain rains, everything things as something for us. And so a tree might think as a tree differently for a lumberjack versus a carpenter versus a tree surgeon, and might think differently at different times in history. But Parmenides is saying there's another sense of being that's not specific to a thing, but occurs with all things.
So it's possible that the way to think about it is as an all, but it's not directly the way he says it. He's saying something like before the every part of that all, there's the one part of it. One thing necessarily happens. Being is. Other contingent things may happen in addition or instead or inside, but that being is not contingent in the way any of those other things are. And what that contingency means is something like a factoring over experiences, times, places, things for which it is happening. All of that is the fracturing of the one being is into the many beings are, but he is talking about something which is prior to that fracturing, and he is not talking about that prior as being something that is simply the result of integrating over all of the fractured things. He's addressing it directly as an event that occurs. Being is, and necessarily so.
Right. So in that sense, things always thing in a particularly contingent way for the person they're presencing for, but there's a universal sense of being, and
Yes,
that's
but
what
the issue is you were just talking about things in the plural, and he wasn't talking about those. He was talking about the way being is, and being is not a thing.
Right. And so it's universal though. So
Plato wants to understand what Parmenides is saying here by saying that it is a universal and that it is an idea. And then some people like Aristotle want to turn that universal and idea into an abstraction, which is only a summing over instances that are more ontologically real than the universal is. None of that is Parmenides. For Parmenides, the single thing being and the way that it is first, prior, before any fracturing. And it's not the result of an operation of integration. The reverse. Things are the result of an operation of fracturing. Does that make sense?
yeah, so all things are specific. That would be the fracturing.
Yes.
But
To be is to be an intelligible particular with a separate essence distinct from all other things is the thesis of Plato, who comes after Parmenides, who has not yet granted this proposition. Isabel had a question. Go ahead, Isabel. Or thoughts?
Yes, it's mostly a comment. I think we might bring Hölderlin in here because it is useful in the poem I read in somewhere. It just designates that we are human. Being is. He mentions essential community. We are in an essential community in page 195. In this passage, the useful designates an essential community of rock and shaft, earth and furrow. Those are the elements or the examples that Hölderlin gives. This essential community is in turn determined by the nature of welcome and stay. Because we are here welcomed and we are here staying. I take it in this direction. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a he's trying to get at there this notion of appropriate, this notion of useful, needful, etc., that he sees in, to go this way, something like Hölderlin's pantheism, something like that. But there's it's not at all obvious that any of that is Parmenides' sense of these things. Parmenides is not Hölderlin. Parmenides is not primarily referring here to an essential community that the different finite things have with one another. He's referring instead to a call that truth makes upon thinking to think being, if that makes sense. So it's not about a shared across the community of the experiences. It's a vertical height direction of attention of thought towards being as the highest and most necessary, if that makes sense. It's the truest true. It excels in the direction of truthfulness because it excels in the direction of necessity, and the necessity with which it is true, which is greater even than logical for Parmenides. It's bedrock. When Descartes says the reason he wants to, doubt things and subject things to doubt to arrive at something certain, why does he want to do it? To establish something firm and constant in the sciences. He wants a firm foundation to build on. He doesn't want to build on sand. Well, this to Parmenides is a place where you're not on sand, right? So there's that aspect of what Parmenides is pointing out or emphasizing here in his Needful of the Eon Emmenai. And it's less romantic than Hölderlin. It's more logical than Heidegger, right? Maybe even pre-logical. But Parmenides is not someone who's embarrassed by tautologies. Let's put it that way. He's also not
Jason,
embarrassed by paradoxes, but Christian, go ahead.
Yeah, I just a remark. So I took it also that Heidegger was trying to point out to us that by no means is this saying obvious. That if you take this sort of logistical view of it and view it as a tautology, you're sort of missing something essential. And I sort of read into that, Heidegger has always had this sort of view about our pre-ontological understanding of being, and it sort of underlies everything else that we think, and that even though we have this familiarity with it, we don't explicitly understand it. So I was kind of picking up tones of that in there as well. But do you think it would be accurate to say that Heidegger is saying that Parmenides is maybe pointing to something like, I don't want to call it a fact, but saying something like being is already anticipated in everything else that we think?
Not necessarily anticipated. He does think that for Parmenides, the primary utility of noticing this fact is that it helps to recognize the contingency of all the other kinds of facts. It's a standard of non-contingency before which things which might otherwise look very necessary don't look as necessary as this, something like that. But to get another sense of why this is a non-obvious claim, besides that one, think of Kant, right? When Kant wants to reject the ontological proofs, what does he do? He says, being is not a real predicate. He says you cannot deduce any is from a conceptual definition because conceptual definitions only tell you about your concepts. So it's just our conceptual machinery. It doesn't have any necessary relation to the world. It's not a real predicate. So you cannot make a deduction about an is statement from any essence statements, basically, in Kant, right? Parmenides is violently disagreeing with this here, but not because he thinks that the deduction is simply logical. Parmenides thinks there's such a thing as necessary being, which is exactly the point that Kant is disagreeing with. Kant is trying to overthrow all the ideas of necessary being that were part of traditional ontological proofs and everything like it. And he's doing that because Kant wants to turn logical machinery into something like just a necessary projection of the mind, to which nature is under no obligation to correspond, if you get it. But that's not the way Parmenides sees it at all. Parmenides does not see these things as first of all, not simply logic, because he's pre-logical. This is before Aristotle. Logic has not been codified. And second, the necessity he is appealing to here, he is not generalizing to every tautological statement. He's not saying everything that follows from an essence has this necessity. Only one tautology has this nature. Only tautology is about being. Necessary being is not an attribute of everything which is a logical concept. It's an attribute of one and only one thing, which is not just a concept. It's actual being. It's not the thing the concepts are about. It's the thing that they refer to. Pete, question.
Right. So I guess bringing up Kant helps me refine what I said earlier about universal. And I don't mean it in the Kant sense of the most universal isness essence of everything that becomes meaningless, as Kant complains. So maybe instead of universal, I would say that so all things thing, but being, not being a thing, is actually the structure of how things can thing. So that's the sense of universal I meant, is that it has to always be true in order for things to thing.
Yes, except for Kant, he's, and that structure question, it's precisely because he is interested in the how of things thinging. The things are what of his interest, and the how they do it is, and what structure that implies logically or conceptually or metaphysically is what Kant is interested in. And by the way, he's going to mostly think that that's a question of logical, right? But that's still Kant, not Parmenides. Parmenides is saying something different. He is saying that there is a necessity for that being is, which is not simply a structure or means granted to the fractured things that enables them to thing. It's not a function that being performs for things to allow them to thing separately, right? Again, because the focus is not on things, nor on how things work. When it comes to how things work, Parmenides is going to say that's the realm of the way of mortals, in which being and not being are the same as not the same, and being is conceptual distinction, and being is definition. And that all gets very Platonic very quickly, right? But it's very Platonic, not as the whole thing, but only as the way of opinion, the way of mortals, where we are very far from absolute certainty or reliable truth, where we are trying to be adequate to things with our concept nets or something like that, but there's a contingency in all of it. There's an opinionness in all of it. There's a finiteness and humanness and mortality in all of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Isabel.
Yes, Jason, I wanted to ask you, and I did want to mention that Parmenides is pre-logical,
yes,
pre-calculative, pre-technology. So how can we in September 2023 access this Parmenides world whereby if we wish to translate, and I am a translator, I have been, how can I access that world to be able to fully understand how anyone could think pre-logically, or pre-techno or pre-calculative? The only thing I can think of is art and poetry.
I don't think so. I mean, to me, pre-logical, I mean before the codification of logic by Aristotle. I mean that he is not thinking that Aristotle's division of thinking into logical thinking and non-logical thinking has occurred and is dispositive and is controlling. He is prior to making that distinction. It doesn't matter to him yet. And if it came along, he might not agree with it. So that doesn't mean that he is after that divide and just on another side of that divide than where Aristotle positions logic. That's not what's going on here. What's going on here is that Parmenides has his own map for how thinking manages to relate to its different possible subject matters. And there's one possible subject matter to which he thinks it has a way of relating that has access to a certainty that it does not have in the domain of the merely logical, which is to him a merely. It's a lesser thing. It's not the standard. It doesn't exist yet, right? As Aristotle codified it. But he is not thinking of being as a term. He is not thinking of being as a concept which we use to refer, right? Concepts refer because they point to particular things. You point to particular things because they're particular. Pointing can designate something because it can be differentiated by the category of space. Being isn't like that. You don't point at being, right? You don't have to point at being because it's in all the places, and you can't point at being because it's not one particular place on only one ray of direction in space. So pointing isn't the way in which you refer to it. You refer to it by directly intuiting your access to it as this thing that you know as being. Now, Heidegger may give us an interpretation toward the end of what he thinks that sense of being is for the Greeks. And maybe that's true of the Greeks. It might even be true of Parmenides, so that's a harder thing to show, because Parmenides is not simply a Greek. He's a very particular, very strange, mystical rationalist philosopher with his own very particular view of things, right? But how can I have access to those things? The answer is I have to go think Parmenides' thoughts. I have to see how he is not embarrassed by tautology the way people after Kant are embarrassed by tautology because they've been taught by Kant that because being is not a real predicate, conceptual things are not supposed to result in ontological claims. Kant has never made that argument to Parmenides. Therefore, he is unimpressed with it. Therefore, he is perfectly confident in making is deductions from essence statements. Now, that may be wrong on his part. He doesn't think that it's wrong. Duns Scotus doesn't think that it's wrong. Plotinus doesn't think that it's wrong. Anselm doesn't think that it's wrong, right? Lots of other people in a very long and storied tradition, from Parmenides down to Kant, made is deductions from essence statements and thought they were doing well to do so, right? So we're prior to anyone being embarrassed about that. No one was embarrassed about that until Kant came along. So that's all I need to get beyond that embarrassment. I just need to recognize where it arose and realize that Parmenides had no such thing, and lots of other people had no such thing. And lots of people between Parmenides and Duns Scotus reasoned about necessary being quite a bit and had very large ontological consequences of what they thought about necessary being. It was the basis of their metaphysics. There's a huge part of the history of Western metaphysics. It's about the very idea of necessary being. And what we're seeing in this passage is the origin point of the idea of necessary being as actually necessary. That Cree at the front of the line is where the idea of necessary being as a thought and tradition and subject matter in Western metaphysics arises.
Yeah, he mentions Kant in this section, and he almost seems to accuse Kant of just reducing the concept of being to actuality in Kant, because Kant sort of treats being as if being and actuality are the same. And that's why it's not a predicate. He divorces being from whatness. So it's almost like
you're absolutely right. And the place where there's multiple places where Heidegger goes into that with Kant, including in the Kant book, but in one that we've done together, Basic Problems of Phenomenology, in the chapter on Kant, he goes into this explicitly, and he also makes explicit that the notion of being as actuality that Kant is using there is one that he just borrowed from the late medievals, right? It was not, it's not modern. It's not even original in Descartes. It's just taken over from what am I thinking of? The Spanish Jesuit theologian Suarez. Thank you. Right. Yeah. Yes. He's just taking it over from Suarez. Right. So, okay. And that actuality, why we can go into why that actuality things becomes what people mean by an existence as different from an essence. But Kant is just operating on that basis. And when Kant argues that being is not a real predicate, he's basing that on the Suarezian actuality understanding of existence as opposed to essence. Okay, back when we're in the time of Parmenides, the existence, essence, distinction, anything like that form has not been made. And when he is talking about the being that of which he says eon emmenai, it is a being that is at least as much essence as it is existent. But here they're coinciding. In rain reigns, you can make a clear distinction between them, and you can say that the existence part of rain reigning is contingent, and the essential part that if there's anything raining, it's rain that's doing the raining, and you can call that essential. So you can say there's a logical, tautological necessity that when it's raining, the thing that is raining is the rain. Fine. You can recognize a parallelism between that and that when something is being, the thing that is doing the being is being. That part may be similarly essential and therefore tautological, but there's a difference. That it rains is a contingent thing, and that being isn't. This is Parmenides' fundamental claim. There is no contingency in the claim that being is. None.
Yeah, can I just ask too? It's been a while since I've read any Parmenides myself, and this may actually be in the Platonic dialogue, the Parmenides, but doesn't he make the claim something to the effect that the all cannot not be, that it is impossible for it not to be? And this claim is, when he's saying being is, he's pointing to that same necessity.
Yes, he's saying being is the same as saying it is impossible that being is not.
Yeah, okay.
James?
Would you say that Kant, was breaking up the notion of being into the phenomenon and the noumena, and so the noumena would be the essence for Kant, right? And he's saying that we don't know the noumena, we don't know the essence, and so
he lets essences be very much the sort of conceptual content of thought, and he doesn't need the essences to be the things in themselves. But yes, there is a part of this which is breaking things up into phenomenal and noumenal. But what Kant is doing there is he's claiming that all of our concepts refer to phenomena, and the only thing they have to have a noumenal hook into them is a bare X, as a bare thing in itself, as a bare underlying subject that is the place where we unify our conceptual determinations about something. But that we posit, project, whatever, such a required X is to Kant, purely logical function. The thing in itself is a logical function. It doesn't have a content that's an essence that just happens to be unknown to us. It doesn't have content. It's just a bare X. If it had content, that content would be conceptual and it would be phenomenal to Kant, right? The claim is that everything we do when we think is phenomenal because everything we do when we think has content, right? And all the contents are like that. So yes, there is that distinction between phenomenal and noumenal going on in Kant, but it's precisely in order to reduce the noumenal to an unknowable X that therefore doesn't enter into how the logical machinery works, right? Now, what is involved in that is the idea that he's turned this into a truth of being where we know the bones of the world into how our mind must work. What has happened when he makes the phenomenal move, the Copernican revolution, is he thinks he's no longer just talking about the world, he's now trying to talk about the mind. Okay, so that's part and parcel of this distinction. Yes, and that's what Kant is doing here. Is it an accident that at the very moment when that differentiation has been made and where we're moving from standing before the tree in bloom to the tree in bloom being an idea in our heads, that at that very moment necessary being is being overthrown as a concept? I put it to you, it is not. These two developments are related, right? Kant is part and parcel of the move that has turned the tree standing before us on the meadow as being the being that underlines and is prior to any of our thoughts and concepts about it into the conceptual tree as the phenomenal tree, as the model of the Gaussian electric charges spinning in the void, being in, essentially in our head, right, that you get in Kant. The same person who is doing that, and for reasons that have to do with the same, if we can put it this way, logical move on what thinking is the person who is denying necessary being with the statement that being is not a real predicate, and therefore you cannot devise is statements from essential statements. Okay, So I'm noticing that Parmenides is a non-Kantian, right? I'm noticing that something serious happens in the history of Western philosophy between Parmenides and Kant, and that in that reaction to the tree on the meadow bit, Heidegger is anti-Kant, but not anti-Parmenides, right? Okay. So
isn't he also anti-Cartesian? Because it seems like Descartes was the one who separated the mind from the body, and so
he does.
Yeah.
Heidegger does think that the modern Torrance doctrine kind of starts with Descartes, but the particular thing that he placed the accusation on, if I can put it this way, in the first part of this book, in part one, was this. He reduced it to this claim of Schopenhauer, right, about the individual mind, right? So I think he did that because he didn't want it to be complicated by the questions of a historical subject in Hegel or a transcendental ego in Kant or these other things which are less clear than what it is in Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, whereas in individual consciousness. But that's just his choice of the endpoint, the choice of the endpoint for his foil in the discussion about the tree in bloom. He wanted to go all the way to where subjectivism gets by the time of Schopenhauer, because there he's got the full contrast for where Heidegger is, right? Are there origins of that place where Schopenhauer is before the tree in bloom that are already there in Descartes? To a degree, but he's not all the way to Schopenhauer yet, if that makes sense. Dan.
Yeah, if I may step back a little bit. So I think with this statement that being is like the opposite is like for Heidegger, beings are not. So we cannot say that beings are, because kind of like always a being is appears as something. So it's kind of is using that is. So only being is, the beings they are not. They are always as something else. So they use that kind of is from the being to be something. So they beings borrow being from being, something like that. And going back also to this, like being is, this is, I don't think this is necessary. It's necessary for us today, but for Heidegger, this is something like is inception. So when Heidegger or Parmenides says being is, it was not a necessary statement. It was kind of a inception statement. So it's necessary after that point.
I'm gonna partly agree with you that is where Heidegger is going. He wants to say that the trajectory that Parmenides puts us on had a historical contingency to it, and that it was something about what appeared to him and how he formulated it and how he responded to a particular call before the matter to be thought had on him, whatever. Heidegger wants to put all this historical contingency on what Parmenides did, but Parmenides doesn't. Parmenides thinks he's thinking a necessary truth about being that is true for all time. And he doesn't think that is a historically contingent decision whereby he is founding Western civilization and sending philosophy on a career. He is not a historical careerist trying to make a historical project. It's people afterwards coming along who are wondering if it's going to end that are doing that to him rather than for him, if that makes sense. James?
Yeah, so Heidegger, seems to have associated him with himself with Husserl, right, who is a phenomenologist, and he says that he begins his philosophy with the phenomenology.
Yes.
So does that, so I'm trying to understand his transition from that to this notion of being, which is
he starts with Husserlian phenomenology, which in a way can be thought of as being in a Cartesian tradition, if you like. But he, after deepening that in being in time and showing all the ways in which the structures that are involved are not merely the purely perceptual ones that Husserl focused on, but include all the elements of the life world, something like that. Even at that stage, someone could read that, could understand all that as a Kantian project that's trying to explain the different ways in which the mind machinery projects not only objects and space and the forms of the sensuous intuition as in Kant, but also moods and meanings and the other affective elements of the life world, and especially time sense and all that sort of stuff that you get in the early Heidegger. But by the late Heidegger, after we've gone through all the essence of truth stuff, by the time we've arrived here, he's making claims a bit more than that. And I think some of it was already foreshadowed in Being in Time, where he taught us that Dasein is always already living in the truth, and that Dasein is fundamentally ecstatic and outside of itself and already plugged into the world. And that extra something that has happened is the world of truth in which Dasein exists is not a projection of the mind, which is something inside that's a movie projector. It's the actual world. It's the actual truth, right? And if you like, that can be seen as parallel to the Hegelian move that the constructions of the transcendental consciousness are, truth or are reality, not just, some movie theater show about it. But that's where we've gotten to by the time standing before the tree in bloom, he claims that we stand on the earth and the tree is not in our heads, right? He has extended the subject matter about which the projection machinery is supposed to function to such an extent that it has colonized enough of everything in a wide enough sense that the outside is gone and the outside isn't the outside anymore, right? Dasein is always already outside of itself, right? So it is already plugged into the world, and the world into which it is plugged is the actual world. You can also think of this as a fulfillment of the Nietzschean desire to, if you abolish the Platonic distinction between the true and the apparent world, you don't remain only in an apparent world. You're just in the damn world. Does that make sense?
So the Dasein is no longer a subject, but is a kind of a
correct.
Object.
It is the place. It's not even an object. It is the place or site where being happens. It is the place or site where the truth of being transpires as a happening.
So something like a Parmenides being, Parmenides oneness of being.
Not simply. There were lots of traditional understandings, I can put it this way, in the Neoplatonic tradition that would have granted much of this stuff about Dasein as mind or spirit to Heidegger, but would still have put all of that inside of a being and a one whose necessity was prior to that of Dasein. And they would make Dasein only a appearance within, something like that. But my point is that I'm not saying that that's where Heidegger goes. I'm saying that there are Neoplatonic constructions that would accept all this stuff from Heidegger, but still put all of it inside of a Parmenidean one, if you get me. So how necessary or sufficient are any of these distinctions and where people are going, open question, right? Are there different ways of putting these pieces together, or are they, views that are necessarily divorced from one another? Less of the latter than people might think coming in, because philosophers are inventive and they always have explanations for the way other people have interpreted the world, and they can take the way someone else interpreted the world and put inside their interpretation of the world, and they're very good at this. So anyway, I'm saying that a modern Parmenidean will have a way of colonizing Heidegger just as much as Heidegger has a way of historicizing the action of Parmenides as contingently sending Western philosophy on its career in the way that Dan was describing, right? Those are each describing the activity of a different philosophical school from within their own.
Well, the question of what is thinking, it would be not just the individual subject thinking, but it would be, the whole oneness of being thinking.
There's obviously different relations on this, but for Heidegger, thinking is something like responding to a call from truth itself to think what most deserves to be thought, which is thinking about being, something like that. Taking part in the revealing of or unfolding of the truth of being, something like that. And that is a particular activity. Certainly not all people engage in it. He's using the term thinkers for those who are more or less engaged in that activity, but that makes it a term of distinction and not something which he's saying all human beings do whenever they get out of bed in the morning and their eyes open, right? So thinking is being used in multiple senses here, and it's in its weightier or deeper sense, it only refers to this question about the history of the revelation of the truth of being, something like that. I don't know if that helps.
It seems like the truth of being would be, for ordinary, people, it would be just the way of, doing what you do every day. And
well, truth of being means something like the unfolding, arising, appearing of being to Dasein. And yes, there are everyday senses of that. There's all the everyday interpretations of that. There's the particularity that individuals have in that, and there's even the historical particularity of it, of that being of beings will appear in a given epoch in a given way. According to Heidegger, he's definitely interested in making that a changing and historical thing. But that there is such a history, that there is such a career, and that there are change points and inflection points along it, is what he's highlighting here as the domain of thinking as a historical activity, if you get me. But he's not doing that in order to point out that there is an everydayness to it. He spent, the whole early part, Being in Time and Basic Problems, on the average everydayness, where we've long since left the everydayness. We're talking about peak things that thinkers do now, which is not something everyone does every day. I don't know if that helps.
So there's a difference between the thinking of by the readiness in hand and the presence in hand thinking. Right.
Again, that's way back in early Heidegger, and when we're talking about changing the way in which man understands truth and the way being appears to man, he's talking about all of these actual epochs and changes in the history of metaphysics, and that is not simply going to be encapsulated into one distinction between two kinds of meanings of present being in Being in Time. It's not, right? It's deeper than that, right? From the standpoint of the later Heidegger, those distinctions in Being in Time are one particular set of stresses or meanings that he himself, enunciated then to clarify some things about the structure of the life world, something like that. But they're not the rubric in which to understand, all possible meanings of being to all possible configurations, even within metaphysics, let alone outside of it. So you should avoid the attempt to force all those things you get in later Heidegger and his historical thoughts about it into a conceptual framework that's coming out of Being in Time that doesn't have enough room for that. You have to put it in its own proper space. Its own proper space is the stuff you get elaborated originally in the Nietzsche lectures, and also in things like The Essence of Truth and this book here, where you're sort of early Greek thinking, where you're getting the historical sweep of at what level do these things change, and you have to let that play out in the terrain he's laid out for it, or for that matter, on the terrain where it actually happened, meaning the actual history of all the things he's talking about, not just the way he talks about them. If you try to fit all that into just 6 distinctions out of Being in Time, it won't fit. It just won't fit. I hope that helps. Okay, so I got to a little bit of what I wanted to get to on the Kant and contingency thing. I want to bring out a little bit more when he gets onto actually translating Cree, and we that's the word at the beginning of the line, which is usually translated as needful or necessary, and that he's translating as useful. And we talked a little about some of his senses of what that useful is. I want to just point out some things about that word. Cree has lots of meanings in this sense. One who crees, ruler. Creon is an anonymous ruler of Thebes, who is the one that Odysseus overthrows, and then after Odysseus is exiled, not Odysseus, Oedipus. Sorry, after Oedipus is exiled, it's another Creon that comes in, and there's the Creon, and that's the Creon who is the ruler of Thebes after the brothers have killed each other for the Antigone, right? The word just means ruler. A Creon is a ruler, one who crees. one who decrees what is necessary, one who decrees what is needful, one who rules, is the same word that's being used here, that he's translating as the useful. So needful, necessary, obligatory, ruling, useful, all of these together are what's there in the word. Just in the word first. But if you put it in the context of Parmenides' whole poem, afterwards, the immediate following line, as Heidegger himself stresses, is about taking something to heart. But then after that, there's an argument presented for it. The argument presented for it is, for away from being, you will not find thinking. Right? This is related to this, it's not so that something is not, right? Without being, you cannot find thinking. He's saying that thinking itself rests upon a being. It rests upon being. And it rests upon being in two senses. First, something like thinking worthy of the name is thinking about being, or it is not properly thinking, or it is false. One claim. And this is a kind of version of a correspondence theory of truth, if you like, in the Platonic sense. You have to think true things about being, or you're not thinking about being. But second, thinking as the thing that happens, the thing that transpires, only subsists in being. It's not like thinking happens with independent ontological support off in a Kantian realm of movie projectors, but that sometimes, occasionally, a contingent world happens along that happens to be physically instantiated and happens to have some actual logical machines in it that do things. No. Being has to first be for thinking to exist. Right? And that's what Parmenides is laying out in the apart from being, you will not find thinking in the didactic poem. And then he's going to contrast all that quickly and sharply with the way of mortals. Okay. I think it was it I don't remember who it was. It was just Dan who brought up the ways in which these maybe it was Pete who brought up the ways in which being is and the beings only seem or borrow their being from being, something like that. That's exactly the structure of argumentation that you get in Plato's Parmenides, as the stuff that Parmenides and his student Zeno supposedly engaged in. They engaged in long dialectical, logical-looking discourses about what follows if you assume that being is, but the beings are not, but only seem, and that sort of thing. And which of those things result in contradictions of each other or of apparent experience. And if they only result in a contradiction of apparent experience, maybe it's experience that's wrong. That's the kind of thing you get in Plato's Parmenides. And that's also why you can call him pre-logical, but there is an element of what he's doing here, which is this logic-like thing, in the sense of what he and his school was, why he and his school were called rationalists, right? Because they made what passed a test of reasoning count as a standard of truth higher than what their senses told them, right? Higher than or prior to what their senses told them. They would disbelieve their senses if their senses said motion exists and reasoning said it does not, for example. And this is something they were castigated for by people like Aristotle. But this is why people like Parmenides in his school are called, rationalists. It's because they want the standard of what reasoning seems to support as true to be a higher standard than anything like senses or experience. This, by the way, is, I think, where Heidegger would part company with Parmenides. Yes, they both think that thinking is about thinking about being, but for Heidegger, the being he wants to anchor in is not fundamentally a matter of reasoning. It's a matter of experience. And they're both talking about knowing, and they both mean something like intellectual intuition by knowing. But for Heidegger, intellectual intuition is something that you do with your feet on the grass, if I can put it that way, right? It's an embodied experience of, direct intuition of the reality that you encounter. And it has the status of an empirical observation. It has the status of experimental physics. It doesn't have the status of mathematical reasoning, establishing a truth in point set topology, which it often seems to for Parmenides, or at least Zeno. Dan?
Yeah, along the lines that you are talking, it's like if being appears as presence, thinking also, because it's coming, it's requires being, is also like, it's for Heidegger is some kind of presencing, like we stay there in front of the tree, we experience the tree and everything that, but then we step away from the tree, and then we think of the tree, and we bring it to our mind, like make that like from memory, from, it's not something logical, it's something we make the tree presence again in our, and that's how we, I don't know, bring the tree again back, and we.
Yes. So thankful memory evokes the being of the tree, or the past of the experience of the tree, or the truth of the encounter with the tree. And that thankful memory is the place or site in which the sheltering of the past experience occurs. And terms, words, language are summoning spells for those thoughts that hold in thankful memory the actual past embodied experience. So the ontological structure here is the embodied experience of the direct encounter is first. That's where truth primarily happens. Secondarily, there is thought as thankful memory that holds in a shelter in truth the possible reappearing of that encounter. And then language as words, if are summoning spells for those memories. They bring back those things out of thankful memory and reenact the meaning or the of the appearing, the experience of the appearing of the original noetic intuition of the present reality, the present being of the tree. That's definitely the structure that Heidegger is laying out here, and in it, thankful memory is kind of core, and in it, contact with being is always present noetic contact with, we would say, an actuality, right? It's something transpiring in time, right? And that's the way in which Heidegger is way less rationalist and terminological, and way more grounded and physics-like than anything like even an Aristotle, let alone a Parmenides. Aristotle is thought of as being, less rationalist and more focused on material particulars than a Plato. Fine, but he's also the codifier of logic, right? And he's got all this room for important truths that are, tautologically true as mere interrelated sets of abstractions and relations among terms, right? And for Heidegger, all of that always has a thinness to it that requires the feet to make contact with the ground in a way that a pauper would recognize as a place where your theories have to touch an external reality, and that is a direct intuition of an experienced being, something like that. So there are vast, put it this way, temperamental differences, and they're not just temperamental differences, they're actual differences in conviction about something like ontological priority and conviction about truthiness. Think of it this way. For Heidegger, the thing which is of maximal truthiness is the feet on the ground, trusted experience of the tree, your encounter with the tree in bloom actually occurring. And he's learned that from his careful phenomenology with Husserl. He's learned that from your mind is allowed to have intentions, and it's allowed to have the intentional objects of its consciousness, and the things that it thinks about are those things that it intends. It's not thinking about illusions, and it's not thinking about terms. It's thinking about the things it's trying to think about, and the whole structure of being and time and all the rest of it are trying to show to you that those things actually touch reality. They actually make contact with the world. So, but that embodied intuition sense is the fundament sense of truth that you get in Heidegger. And he's trying to evoke a little bit of that here when he talks about the laying before you and the taking to heart and all those things that he hears echoing in the Greek words, which is fair, are in the Greek words. But that doesn't mean that Parmenides has that same notion of what is the truthiest truth. For Parmenides, the truthiest truth is the truth that cannot be shaken, the truth that that nothing can undo, that nothing can assail, that has no contingency to it, that is absolutely necessary. And that is the truth that eon emmenai, that being is. Dan?
Yeah, like since you mentioned Popper, like for him, we touch reality there in some logical space, especially in those falsifications. For Heidegger, we touch it where it's in being there. We are already there. It's where That's what
Yes.
we touch. Yeah.
Yes, but like take Popper for a second, right? Popper is using all his falsification machinery because he's worried that a merely logical machinery, Kantian or only are that the kind of error, truth is a kind of error without which creatures like us could not live, you know, a Nietzschean technological sense of truth. He's worried that all those things are just going to be concept nets that are purely nominally created and are only, you know, whatever they're used for, whatever they're good for, whatever they manage to accomplish. But the thing which he wants them to actually accomplish is to make contact with an external reality that is actually there, because he doesn't want to be imprisoned in a subjectivist movie theater, if you get me, right? And that's sort of ground truth for Popper, right? He doesn't think he's living in a movie theater. He thinks he's living in the actual world, and he wants to make sure that any of this logical conceptual machinery, even if you think about it as nominally as people around him wanted to, right, actually has to make contact with external facts that get to decide what is and what isn't, right? And that's the experimentalist in him, so to speak. But it has to do with the same sense of, at least in this regard, he's Aristotelian, right? At least in this regard, he wants the material particulars to be the judge of the truth of things. There are people in modern scientific tradition who don't have that, who do not have that, you know, who would think that if the truth is elegant enough, even if it describes the entire universe as being a piece of math, it might be true, right? Even if every element of it followed necessarily in a way that Popper would say, if it all follows necessarily, it cannot make contact with reality. If there's nothing can falsify it, it's not even science. But a Max Tegmark might say, this mathematical universe can explain everything that exists and everything fits inside of it, and that's probably what the world is. That piece of math is the world, right?
But that's because Tegmark postulated that everything that is mathematics. He already started with that assumption.
And necessarily started with that assumption. It's, you know, he's willing to entertain that assumption if it can explain everything, right? And why? Because he's part of that same tradition that goes back to people like Parmenides and Plato and Pythagoreans that is trying to use rational concepts that might embarrassingly be tautological to understand the world. And they're not embarrassed that it's tautological if everything fits inside of it. James.
Yeah, could you say that he's also making use of empiricism and he's definitely making use of hermeneutics, right? Could you go into explaining how he applies the hermeneutical method in his, you know?
I think the calling it empirical is fair but crude in the sense that it's true. It's an empirical kind of direct intuition sort of appeal, but it's not empiricism as the Lockeans understand empiricism, where the Lockeans want to claim something like all of our ideas first come from our sense experience or something like that. That's what empiricism usually means in those contexts. So yes, it's not misleading to say that this sense of truthiness that you get in Heidegger has an embodied empirical element to it that doesn't like the mere logicians, so to speak. But it's empiricism used in a loose sense, not in the Lockean sense, if you get me. As for the hermeneutic stuff, I mean, I think this can take us too far afield. I mean, fundamentally, it's about how you read things and signs and things. The closest we would get is if we talked here a little bit about the nature of language when we get to legacy and what it means. But the person who is good on what how to read hermeneutics essential to Heidegger, it would be Gadamer. If you want to explore that angle further, read Truth and Method, and it will be helpful for you on that. But it's going to take us too far afield here, I think. There are ways in which it does tie together with some of the things he says about meaning and being in time, and some of the things he says about language here. But I'd rather just talk about it in the terms of language here. He doesn't bring up hermeneutics or interpret. He mentions interpretation a couple of times in passing here when he says that, you know, all translations are an interpretation. That's an appeal to that sort of hermeneutics machinery a bit. But he's not stressing it. So I think we just complicate it to bring it in here. But if you want to think about it that way, I'd point you to Gadamer. I hope that helps.
I was going to say, I think Heidegger would just be much more comfortable talking about the concrete situation rather than like sense data or empiricism. I think
Yes.
he sort of purposely avoids those terms.
Yeah, see, he talks about the tree and bloom because he's worried that if you talk about the tree and bloom as sense data, you'll end up thinking that the tree doesn't actually exist and only the electric gossamer charges spinning in the void exist. And he thinks that the tree obviously exists, and if your theory of thin gossamer charges spinning in the void can conform to it, it may be useful for understanding things about the tree. But if it doesn't, then it's the gossamer charges that are wrong, not the tree. Right, the tree's data and the experience tree is data to him. But anyway, that's stuff we got back in the tree and bloom thing. Okay, so I think I stressed the cray enough. I think we went over the useful stuff enough. We haven't got onto the saying part, the saying and the different meanings of logos here. But I want to give people a chance before we move off cray and move towards logos. Give people a chance to react to any of the stuff I've been laying out about where I see Parmenides and his stressing on necessary being as the reason why he cares about this emmenai. Further reactions to that, or is it just, can we move on to how Heidegger is going to read the Lagan part? All right, I'm taking that as we can move on to the Lagan part. So I think it was he brought up the gathering, right? Other places where he's called upon to translate this word, he's always stressing the sense in which Lagan in Greek means gathering together. And here he's instead saying that it's a lying, it's a letting lie before. And you're right, Pete, that we have colloquialisms in English that make this notion in Greek make sense to us. You know, you lay something out, you lay something before someone. In that sense, to elaborate terminologically with distinctions is what we mean by to lay something out, right? But we have a notion of that as a breaking down or an analysis. And here, in English, I mean, and here Heidegger is stressing instead the laying before, the bringing to appear as something that can be separately re-experienced that Dan was getting at, right? The point is that the speech about things is supposed to let the hearer of the speech about the things, if it's not just chatter, but as meaningful utterances, as Heidegger likes to say, inspect the thing itself, inspect the experience of the thing itself, recreate the experience of the thing itself. There's places, several places here where Heidegger says the important thing is the seeing, right? And if the speech brings you again to the seeing, then it's done its work, right? But you have to independently be brought to the seeing again. And this is again going back to the thankful memory part. There's the words are there to evoke the seeing, and the seeing is the place where the thinking occurs, and the thinking is about the being, right? So the structure is being first, and thinking about it, then speaking about it, and never the other way around. And this is also why Heidegger has independent reasons for not liking tautology and not like and being inclined to agree with some of Kant's being is not a real predicate kind of stuff, right? He wants people to not reason from the terms, but to use the terms just to reinspect the things themselves and ascertain for themselves whether or not the reinspected things do or do not bear out what the words say about them. Okay, so and in that structure of what those relations are, I think he's just right. I think that when people try to reason about those things backwards, they get confused and they make mistakes. Yes, it can be a useful guide, and one of the reasons that this happens is because when you're trying to externalize a completed thought, you do it by trying to encapsulate into words that are meant to help the other person come to it. But there are notoriously gaps in that. There's semantics needed, right? Can you convey the whole thing to someone with just your piece of syntax if he doesn't have all your semantic hooks to connect it up to the experiences he's supposed to connect it to? And this is where, we're talking about translation. The indeterminacy of translation problem winds up turning on this, right? It's because the semantic hooks are always missing. There's always more than one way of reading it, right? Why is there more than one way of reading it? Because the terms themselves are not sufficient to pin down which thought you meant, right? this is again some of the stuff that Derrida stresses that Pete was bringing up, right? Because the terms themselves are not enough to pin down what you meant, you have to sympathetically read. You have to re-experience what the thinker first had as his own thought. Well, you don't know if it was what he had. You only know that it's what it evoked for you, right? And this is a point that Heidegger is stressing and that Derrida follows him in stressing, right? The rereading is an attempt to reestablish the connection with the original experience that had the original thought, something like that. From Heidegger's point of view, stressing the indeterminacy of that and the indeterminacy of translation, as a lot of later thinkers did, and people like Derrida did, is engaging in a lot of deliberately uncharitable reading, right? And Derrida may have his own strategic reasons for doing that at times. Leave that aside as a debate. Will take us too far afield. But what Heidegger himself is saying is that the sympathetic reading, the reading that tries to understand the meaning the original thinker had, is meant to bring you to the thought the thinker had before. It's meant to recover into your own thankful memory, your own intellectual intuition of the thing that evoked the language in the first place. And the language is ministerial to that thought and evoking. And that's also part of why here he stresses the ordering of these things. Why would he say to say and to think in that order? Don't you have to think it first before you say it? And there's none of that ordering there, or tension about that ordering there in Parmenides. It's all coming in from Heidegger. But for Heidegger, that order is important, right? You can't enunciate without the thought coming first. Anyway, so thoughts on this legacy stuff. I'm trying to lay some of this out in the way I see it here and relate it to some of the interpretation questions people were asking. I think it's fair to say that these meanings are there in the word in Greek, but in the way that Parmenides is using it in the passage, where he's trying to say what is necessary, he is trying to say something like, it is necessary to think this. It is necessary to say this. He's trying to say, if you try to say otherwise, you will get confused. If you try to say otherwise, you will be entangled in error. You will be entangled in contradiction. You are not able to deny these propositions and reason coherently. That's the actual claim that I see Parmenides making in this passage, which is much closer to saying something about how you have to speak, in the sense of how you have to speak if you expect to remain coherent, right? Parmenides thinks there's an impossibility in denying this proposition without contradicting yourself, if you get me. And I don't think that's necessarily what Heidegger is bringing out here when he's just stressing the letting lay sense of this. I think a lot of that is him trying to tie this back to his own thankful memory machinery and less concerned with whether or not it was the actual thought there in Parmenides saying it originally. Parmenides is saying something like there's a duty to say it this way because this is, your saying has to conform to the reality, something like that. But the necessity in it isn't just that, you have a duty to think this clearly or something like that. You have a duty to lay this out the way it is. It's also an impossibility of doing otherwise. It's an incoherence in doing otherwise. The attempt to do otherwise will fail, is the claim that Parmenides is actually making here. Okay, thoughts on any of the legacy stuff?
So does he seem to be saying, so it's not merely a logical necessity, and he wants to sort of retranslate this needfulness as usefulness, but in a sense he distinguishes that very clearly from just sort of utility.
Yes.
But more in the sense that he says we use something and we come into a community with it and let it be what it is. So we allow the thing its essence, and he seems to be saying that we have to come into community with a thinker in a similar way.
To a degree, but I mean the contrast in the first part, right, with the usefulness part, I mean, is there's a letting the beings be the beings they are, heeding the call that they make on how they are to be handled, used, what they are for. There's a teleology embedded in things that is something like the structure of their intelligibility itself, right? And that is distinguished from manipulating them for our purposes that are alien to them, right? To be comical about it, there's the old thing of, what do you make of this? And he says, oh, I don't know, I can make a hat, I can make a brooch, whatever, you can crumple the thing up and turn it into anything you need it to be, right? But in doing so, you're doing violence to the thing, and you're not, it's supposed to be a piece of paper that you read, right? The use of the thing in the proper way that is heeding the call of how to use it is the sense he's pointing to here. And I think
I was going to say there's something like a most proper use, which sort of comes from the thing itself.
Yes, the thing to understand is that that's exactly why there is this whole notion of the good and the good in things in Plato and the Neoplatonists, right? The reason they put this or teleology in Aristotle, the reason they put teleology and final causes things in Aristotle, the reason that they said that the good of things is part of their nature and is part of the structure of their intelligibility in the Platonic school, all those are taking a standard of appropriateness from the nature of things, right? This is something that in the history of Western thought kind of got dropped with the turn to the moderns, because the moderns don't trust nature that way anymore, right? Something else has intervened in the meantime outside of or above nature that is their standard, and they have denigrated nature as a standard, and they don't believe in teleology as a result, right? They don't believe in the natural purposes and things. But Parmenides here clearly does, and I think that Heidegger is right to point out that those senses are in the Greek. He's also right to point out those senses in someone like Hölderlin and the Romantics and the German idealists of that time, which are trying to they have enough Neoplatonics in them that they have that sense of this meaning and purpose and things. But you have to understand that that's not something everyone simply agrees with, right? It's something that lots of moderns don't agree with.
And it's a very different kind of necessity as well. Very different from just sort of an abstract logical necessity.
Yes, and it's necessity. It's a needfulness rather than a necessity, and he's stressing this element of use because it's a. I think there's two reasons why he's stressing it. One is because it does have this needful as responding from a call, sort of proper use sense, but also it's meant to be a sort of forceful contrast with how he thinks technology thinks about all of these things, right? When you think about conceptual machinery as a tool for human purposes, when like a Nietzsche, you think that truth is a kind of error without which creatures like us cannot live, right? That there just are particular bits of short-sightedness, but that are useful for us for what we're doing right now. They're all just tools, right? The nominalist in the building will tell you that these needfuls you're adhering to are only as needful as your purposes for as long as they conform with them, or something like that. And he's contrasting useful in this Greek sense with that sense of useful, the mere utilities sense of useful. But he's using a word that could easily mean either one, right? He's choosing to use a word that could mean either one.
And he calls it a community too, which I thought was really telling about the way that he wants to see. Yeah, he doesn't want to turn it into this technological.
Yeah, but partly he's taking that from Hölderlin, and you have to understand that the community aspect in the Hölderlin time might be different from Heidegger. In Heidegger, the community he's stressing is between the person and the thing, and between the things with one another. In the German idealists of Hölderlin's time, I'm thinking of people like Hegel, right? The community is meant in a much more human sense than that, and it's not the community of the things; it's the community of the people. And the transcendental mind that is the thing in itself for Hegel is more like the communal spirit. And there's plenty of that communal spirit in Hölderlin, if you get me. So the point is that Hölderlin may not be as Heideggerian as Heidegger sometimes read him, because sometimes Hölderlin is just a Hegelian.
He's more Hegelian,
Yes,
makes sense.
Dan?
Yeah, I was thinking that this usefulness, so this is Heidegger of the event, so being as the event, so this usefulness, like Parmenides here, is kind of grounding this usefulness in the event, as Heidegger sees it, is everything is going there. Being is part of this event, so it's kind of, I don't know how to say it, but it's everything is connected and it goes back to the event, like for Heidegger, I think at this time, and it's Parmenides calling it this.
Oh, sorry, I'll let you finish. No, so I think partially so, and but he's not bringing that out. He's not stressing that point of possible commonality with Parmenides. The other thing I'll say is that there's plenty of, if you go this way, Neoplatonic types who would, be all over this usefulness business, and they say this usefulness business is just the good in things, and the good in things is the good in things that was put there by the one that causes them, right? And they would get, very teleological about it, and they would be perfectly happy to relate all that to the event of the one making the world, something like that, right? The point is that you can read all that event stuff in a very Neoplatonic way, and it doesn't have to have the Heideggerian historical and if I go this way, grounded experiential notes that it has for Heidegger himself. And why does that matter here? Because Parmenides is the founder of that tradition, right? Really. So you should not expect Heidegger seeing those notes to be able to distinguish his position from a Neoplatonic reading of his position. Because if he's trying to find the ways in which his understanding of event and Parmenides agree, he's also going to be finding the places where the Neoplatonic tradition that is being founded by Parmenides also agrees with his reading of events. Right? It's just you can't find your commonality with the founder of a school without finding your commonality with the school, if you get me. I don't know how sensitive anyone is to this, because I have no idea how alien any of this Neoplatonic understanding of these things is to people, but I can assure you that it's there. Isabel?
Yes, I wanted to go back to the concept of stating and laying out. And it seems to me that it's very similar to, maybe if you might agree with me or not, of a painter painting. And he's very enthusiastic in doing his brushstrokes, but he has to step back and lay it out before him, and then he perceives what he's seen. Otherwise, it's very difficult for him. In other words, he has to be both the producer and the receiver at the same time. And as I take it, then this could be the laying out. And I also wanted to say that in reference to language, that we formulate things in words and we lay out things in statements so that others may understand us. But I want to just qualify that. And I say, just like the painter, we say things in words and we lay things out so that we can understand what we're saying. And even so, Jason, even so, language has such is such a fountain, such a bottomless fountain, that out comes something that we had no idea that we actually produced, or that was actually there. And language, I understand that. That's what he says also about one of the qualities of language. Thank you.
Yeah, so I heartily agree with you that we don't just enunciate and speak, formulate things in words in order to communicate them to others, but also to communicate them to ourselves and to get clear about them. Absolutely. And do we thereby sometimes discover implications and thoughts and things that we didn't have going in? Yes. There are some people on the linguistic end of things, the more constructivist end of things, if you like, that see that fecundity of association, so to speak, that language natively has as being what thinking itself is, or where thinking itself arises, or as just that richness of possible cross associations is sufficient for them to call it thought. And Heidegger is not there. Heidegger does see those phenomena in language that you mentioned, but he still thinks that there is a there's a priorness to the thoughts as the actual experiences of noetic intuitions of things, that is, I put it this way, a more basic point of contact with truth than the language. The language is a means of evoking of the thankful memory, something like that. So, but I agree with you about the points you made about we enunciate for ourselves, not just for others, and that language can have this richness to it. That richness of language is also something that was stressed, by the way, by some of these other people we were talking about in the German idealist tradition, when people like Hegel are saying that there's something collective about the consciousness that matters for these historical things. They think that it is distributed into things like that. It's distributed into things like the nature of language, distributed into things like the natures of society and cultures through time and all that sort of stuff. It's not in the mind of one thinker to them. It has this intersubjective nature of being to it, right? So and that's something that they stress is true of language, right? Language is not simply personal or a personal servant, so to speak. Even if there is an element of the noetic that is, in some sense, a prior point of contact to truth. But yeah, these are very good things to bring out about language. There's plenty of deeper thoughts on language here. There's one other that we haven't mentioned yet that was related to the gathering thing that Pete brought out, and I want to bring this up. This is just something that I noticed less here and more in the early Greek thinking discussion of the gathering nature of speaking. Why is gathering so fundamental to understanding of speaking, reason, logos for the Greeks, right? What is the gathering aspect of it? It's not just the gathering together of the intuitions of things. It's that words gather. It's in the nature of, if I can put it this way, it's in the nature of using a symbol to evoke something, that it gathers many of the things that it can evoke. There is an instantiation of the Platonic notion of participation in the phenomena of words, right? You can use tree to refer, works because it's a symbol, and that symbol participates in way more than one tree. It gathers the trees, right? So conceptual language refers to this gathering. Logical or essential thinking refers to this gathering. And this is why, people like Plato were, impressed with this, as something which is letting the many beings and the truth about them be about the same thing, right? They can both be in correspondence with this essential, but the gathering aspect of that, I'm just pointing out, is it's there in the nature of symbolic reference in the first place, right? Symbolic reference uses one word to refer to lots and lots of things, right? And it's not that it's not that phenomena doesn't previously exist before language. It's that language is a core instance of it, a core use of it, and therefore it's a model for us, both internally and in our communication with one another, of how this something like conceptual thinking or essential gathering or essential entailment questions works, right? It's our go-to model for participation of many things in one. Thoughts on that? Pete?
Yeah, so I think that this might refer to what Heidegger means when he uses the term polysemic, right? He looks for the polysemic in statements, let's say.
I think it's slightly different because he's referring there. You're right that he doesn't stress that, but it's partly there. He's looking for the two sides of something. He's finding, instances of identity and difference, or instances of ontological difference in any of these things, where you see the polysemy. But the notion of gathering is not simply gathering of polysemy in the sense of words with many senses. there's a more direct sense of in which words are gatherings of things, right? They're just symbolic, right? And symbols are already gatherings of things. I'm sorry, but I'll let you finish your thought.
But words, symbols are gathered in sentences, right? And so words have meanings, and then when they're gathered in a sentence, then specific meanings of those words are in play, right? So
yes, but more than one, and always with semantic hooks off the ends, if I can put it this way. In other words, there's always multiple interpretations of them, because the terms chosen and the syntax of their juxtapositions is never enough to pin it down to just one.
Well, so language in one sense is ontic. So we can just use it to make assertions. Like I say, it is raining, and I mean right now, and it's clear what I'm saying. So there's that part of language. But then we use language to also try to communicate things or invoke things that aren't just simple assertions.
Of course.
Uh,
This is his poetry example, back in the late part one, where he gave the the poet says the moon has risen. When the poet says the moon has risen, he's not trying to tell you an ontic fact outside. Yes.
Yeah, and so that's what Heidegger's going for. And this is all of our struggle is I'm thinking of a thing, but it's not I can't just assert it. I might be thinking, oh, it's raining, and I can say it, but I'm thinking of something else that's not just a simple assertion. So language then needs to gather sort of my thoughts so that they also work in the listener in the same way in the listener. So maybe this is where Heidegger means by Stimmung, that beyond just asserting facts, language also needs to evoke things beyond simple assertions, and that's part of the gathering of these symbols into a sentence, which will then resonate with the other person in the same way, hopefully.
Right, and I understand what you're saying, and it's not just the gathering of the sentence. I mean, there's a gathering of experiences, there's a sharing of experiences, there's the possibility of the experience being, reinstantiated more or less closely. When the poet says the moon has risen, right? He's not making an assertion of what's outside. He's trying to get you to use the words to evoke memory for yourself, that he can tie the emotive aspects and the more nuanced, feeling aspects, the affective aspects of the life world, that you are going to associate with that experience with what he's about to say in the rest of the poem, right? He's going to put you into a place, right? And he's assuming that the evoking of the image is enough to, bring you to a place where he needs you to be for the, the next, 3 stanzas, whatever the poem. The point of that is that when language is used that way, it's still being used from Heidegger's point of view as this, evoking of the thankful memory purpose, right? And I think when he's contrasting things with mere assertion, that's really what he's trying to get at. He's trying to get at the fact that the early Wittgenstein Tractatus logical positivist view of what language is for, right, and as assertion of facts is just, hopelessly shallow as to what language actually is, in the same way that, Husserlian phenomenology needed being in time, something like that, right? Okay, but I agree with all that, and I agree with the points about the it also doing some of those things for ourselves that Isabel kind of made, but there's still a gathering aspect of language, which is its core symbolic function, if I can put it this way. And what I mean by that is that the fact that it acts for us as the model of how symbols can work. And how symbols can work is not simply assertion, and it's not simply reducible to logic, right? Anyway, sorry, Dan has a comment.
Yeah, related to gathering. So we have this kind of in Heidegger, the decay of logos to logic, like what, and I think it's something similar to me, like this gathering, like decaying, like for example, in Kant, in synthetic a priori propositions, like that's all we have left of the gathering. It's, and all that modernity kind of sees in gathering these days is those, I don't know, synthetic judgments that, and they are in propositions, and that's all. But to me, that's kind of points to the original gathering, what Kant did, and that's, and to me goes along the lines of what happened from logos to logic.
I understand what you're saying. I mean, the decay to logic, and logic has many senses over the years, but not Aristotelian logic anymore, but sort of modern logic, logical positivism logic, whatever. Heidegger does see there as being a kind of lessening of what can be evoked, communicated in that. And there's part of that he's getting to by stressing that logos to the Greeks means this laying out, this laying before, the letting lie, and the sense of gathering. But it's not just the communication aspect, and it's not just the contrast with a more limited domain of application aspect. For Heidegger, it's about the direct connection to a truthiness, if you get me, right? Leaving aside anything about communication, right? Is the individual person directly connecting to the height or the depth of the possible truthiness in things that he is experiencing? And the answer is, if he not only lets them lie before him as the individual experience they are, but he also gathers them into their meaningful symbolic constituents, if he organizes them. This is the way in which the gathering aspect of logos is also the order aspect of logos, is the ordering aspects of logos. That is finding and noticing and enunciating more of the truth in things than just leaving it at the bare, I experienced this. The level of I just experienced this, where I haven't organized it into terms, I haven't organized it into thoughts, I haven't organized it into sayings, doesn't have the same truthiness to it. It's not getting the experience. It's not getting what the being is actually conveying in the experience as deeply as it could if it did all those things, right? And this is not simply a contrast with modern logic. It's a contrast between the thinker before he has done the work of the gathering and enunciating versus after.
And just a clarificatory question. This term gathering that we're using, is this the translation of Heidegger's term Ereignis?
No.
Or are we talking, okay, I didn't think
we're
so.
talking about the translation that he often offers of Greek logos and its derivatives in like early Greek thinking, is he stresses that logos, yes, it means speech and comes later to mean reason, but its original word meaning is more like gathering together.
Yes.
Legere, the binding, the gathering together that you get in Latin is coming from the same thing. That the binding things together aspect is there in logos. And in this particular thing, he mentions that only in passing, but he expresses instead this letting lie before, right? So but that's another sense, another meaning or sense that you get in the word logos. And this is why, as he points out, the word for logos is a close cognate to the word for a couch, right? Which it doesn't, not talking about a gathering anymore. It's just talking about letting something lie out, right? So, but the letting lie before you, laying before you, gathering together, as being the core reason, the core intonations behind logos as the word for speech or reason, is what he's trying to get at here. And reason of those is like the cheapest to him. It's the one that's been leveled down. It doesn't mean anything to us anymore. Speech at least refers to speech or saying, the meaningful speech, the meaningful saying that he he shows Parmenides contrast with glossa, giving tongue, right? Logos and glossa. Glossa is just talking in the sense of giving tongue. Logos is actually this sort of actually laying things out, gathering together, logical, right? Reasoning. And what does that gathering together, letting lie before, have in it that glossa, merely giving tongue to something, doesn't have, right? And he's claiming that it's, well, in his other works, he's primarily claiming it's this gathering together notion, and here he's claiming it's this letting the thing lie as it lies, which is, he's saying, is a kind of heeding and conforming to a call the thing has as to how it should be treated, or something like that, which is like a version of why speech has to conform to the thing that it's talking about. We're not at a correspondence theory of truth here, but there is something that the speech about something has to do to be faithful to it. It has to, there's something in what it gathers that has to correspond. What is it corresponding to? The being, the thing that it's talking about, the truth, right? But okay, so anyway, all that's, before at the level of mere assertion, and we're differentiating ourselves from mere glossa as giving tongue, or just enunciating. Logos is a gathering together of what actually lies before you, and then a stating that in organized clarity, something like that.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is great on logos. Where the other word we got to get to is Noen. It's the third word. We're going to get to the eon emmenai and all those other things at the end, but we have to get to. Oh, sorry, Isabel, you have a question or comment on logos before we get to?
Oh, where am I? There I am. No, yes and no. Again, in the terminology stating and laying out, and it's stating and thinking, right? That's what one must state and think.
We're about to get to the thinking part. We haven't gotten to the thinking part yet.
Okay, but I kind of intimated that when I was stating that, or saying that, stating meaning laying out. You lay out so that you may withdraw from you, so you may perceive. You lay it out so you can perceive and take to heart. Mm-hmm. And that's what he's saying. That's what he's saying. That's when he's saying about thinking.
When he gets to the Noen part, yes, he's going to translate it as taking to heart, and he's going to say that Noen has the accent of perceive, but assessus is also perceive, and the line right after this one, as he himself points out in the poem, is all about a particular I urging Parmenides to take this to heart, which means that the taking to heart wasn't necessarily there in the line before, because it's there in the line after. So we're going to have to talk about his translation here. But yes, he does say that Noen is a perceiving that is a taking to heart, and there are those accents in the word. Okay, it doesn't dispose of it.
Isn't that? Aren't we really talking about humility?
Not simply. Not simply. I mean, there is an answering to a call in this. There is a faithfulness to what offers itself to be thought in this, and you could see a virtue of humility in that compared to a willfulness of imposing one's own purposes on things or something like that. But Noen is not simply humility. A humble person does not have to have thought about everything. Let's go on to Noen, right? Let's go on to Noen. So he gives the translation of this Noen part, which is one of the two things you're supposed to do with eon emmenai. You're supposed to say it and think it. You're supposed to let it lie before, and you're supposed to take it to heart. In his translation of it. But what is this Noen business? The closest we got to the Noen business before this was all the thankful memory stuff we got, back in the first part of part one, right? That's the closest to what we're getting to here. But let's notice this whole book is called What is Called Thinking, and the whole of part two is trying to tell us that we're going to have these different definitions of thinking. And the reason we're going through this exercise is because we determined that to arrive at the the most appropriate way to think and the thing which calls upon us to think, we have to look at what was traditionally called thinking. And we want to find out what is traditionally called thinking. We're led to this passage, and this passage is supposed to tell us what is traditionally called thinking. Okay, so we come across this phrase itself because it has the word known in it, and known refers to thinking, right? Otherwise, we would never have come across this in our attempt to learn from history what was historically called thinking as the investigation of proposition 2, right? The known here is why we're here. That's what I'm trying to say, right? So that means that if we didn't come to it with the purposes we have, we would just translate it by thinking and say, that's the reason we're here. We want to talk about thinking, and this is going to tell us what thinking is. Thinking is the thing that, besides saying, you do with the aeon emmenai, and that it is needful that you do with them. Okay, this is telling us something about thinking. This is insufficient for Heidegger, because if he's going to try to define thinking for you, he doesn't want to put thinking on the left-hand side of the equation as well as the right-hand side of the equation, right? He doesn't want to put thinking on both sides of the equation. He doesn't want to define thinking for you in terms of thinking. Okay, fine. And we got a bunch of this stuff about thankful memory already before this. So we know we can understand sort of where he's going. But I want to point out that the taking to heart, he mentions this is on page 175, right? There soon follow the words, all this crayon to Legan and other things, I call upon you to take to heart. It's a line with an I in it, right? It's the I that is doing the urging. Can sound like the voice of Parmenides itself, but it's actually the voice of truth talking to Parmenides and telling him to take this to heart. This isn't the line that we're translating. This is the line after the one that we're translating, right? So if the word known itself just appearing on the line was enough that every Greek reading it was supposed to hear take to heart into it, he wouldn't need this line, but he does. The average Greek does not hear in the word known take to heart, right? That's why, you must also take this to heart is added afterward, right? With entirely different words that don't repeat the word known at all. Okay. Known, naively to the naive Athenian means, and this is one of these weird dual words, it means thought, but thought both as the activity that you can engage in and as the thing which is the product of that activity that you're thinking about. It has the same duality that being has, of being both the active and the noun, right? The action and the noun, or the rain as something which occurs and as something which falls, right? The thought is the rain that falls, and the thought as the activity is the activity of it, the verb of it. So that there's that double sense in the Greek word itself. The other thing that Heidegger is always stressing is the fact that this is a kind of perception. He said in the essence of untruth that known should be understood as intellectual perception. Okay, but the perception part is a thesis. It's the aesthetic. It's the senses. And known isn't one of the senses. It's certainly one of the 5 senses. It's this other sense. You have to put an intellectual in front of it to turn anything sense-like into known. And the intellectual in front of it is doing all the work, is my claim. So Heidegger's sense of where you make feet in the grass contact with truth wants there to be this perception character to noetic intuition, which is fair enough and is true, but it's still intellectual intuition, right? There's still this something noetic about it, and that part is the closest we're getting to that here is the to heart, right? But only if heart is also mind, because it's really taking to mind that he's talking about here, that Parmenides is talking about here, when he's saying that you have to both say and think that being is. And when he's saying that you have to both say and think that thinking is, and he follows it up with, for without being, you will not find thought. He's not saying that because without being, you wouldn't find your heart. That's not the kind of claim he's making, right? The known that you cannot have without being isn't simply a romantic taking to heart, if you get me. So the translation here is something that Heidegger is doing because he's trying to lay out each of the words here with some more depth. He's trying to tie it back to what he said about how thankful memory works, about how he understands, direct connection to being or truthiness himself. But a significant portion of that reading is Heidegger, not Parmenides, or not obviously Parmenides. And I think we have to pay attention to that, right? This is a pushed reading, right? We may like the pushed reading. We may like Heidegger's way of understanding these facts, but that's different from this is what Parmenides was thinking when he wrote the line. And I wanted to bring that out. What does Parmenides later in the same poem say about this impossibility of thinking apart from being? Obviously, we haven't brought in the being stuff, so we can't get all the way to it. But he's saying something like, knowing that doesn't conform to truth isn't knowing. It's glossia. It's babble. Right? And this is a before the letter version of something like a correspondence theory of truth. There's something out there in the world that the thought has to correspond with, or it's false, and it's not thought. There's a no true Scotsman element of this too, if you like. Meaning, if your thought isn't from Scotland, it's not a true Scot or something like that. In this case, it has to refer to being, right? It has to refer to what is. And you get this in Plato too, right? I'm thinking in the Republic, Socrates will say things like, if the thing you're trying to think about truly is, then you can think about it and seem to have sense, seem to have reason, seem to have knowing, seem to have mind, seem to have intellect, is the actual term he will say. But if you try to reason about something which is, not the case, is untrue, you will seem like you have no intelligence. And this is an almost direct evocation of this difference between the two paths in Parmenides, and you get it repeated in the Republic, where the claim is if you try to think about things that are untrue, right, you're going to have incoherent thoughts about them, right? You're going to seem like you don't have sense. Okay. So I want to get at this noetic, this mind, and to what degree we've captured what Parmenides himself is getting at here, and why he thinks that you not only have to say that being is, but you have to think that being is. And when he says you has to, he's not simply saying, else you will be a bad boy, right? He's saying, else you will be mad, else you will be unable to discourse. Thoughts on any of that? Pete?
Yes, so just a technical thing, I guess, in the page 175.
Yes.
I call upon you to take to heart. There's no cardia. There's no heart in the Greek.
I agree. It's not heart. It's just that a noga at the end of the line, right? It's not heart.
So literally, it's saying, sort of like follow your thoughts' commands or something like that.
Yes. There's no heart in it.
Okay.
And there's no repeat of no in either.
Well, so phrases thigh, one of its senses is think.
Yes, but it's not using the word for noetic intuition knowing.
Yeah, that's
right.
True.
Yeah. And the I that is saying that you that is calling upon you to do this is truth itself, right? So there's a truth itself calling to, and it's not even take to heart, but to follow the command of your thinking, something like that. But that's the thing urged, and what is at stake in it, right? What is at stake in it is after that it says it is for apart from being you will not find knowing. Right? This is not part that he's quoting here, but it's in the Parmenides poem, right? Apart from being, apart from na, you will not find knowing. And later, the other famous saying of Parmenides on this thing is that being and thinking are the same, and that being and thinking are the same is quite parallel to this, without being, you will not find known, right? There's a claim that known as this actual thought and the being about which it is supposed to think, and that is supposed to set the standard for what it thinks, and that is the measure of whether or not it actually measures up as thought or becomes, meaningless babble. That being is that standard, and thought is what conforms to that standard. Thought that isn't the same as being doesn't deserve to be called thought to Parmenides. This is why people say he's an irrationalist, right? He's not starting from a notion of thought as a human activity that we all manage to engage in as soon as we open our eyes in the morning, and that having done so, we can ask whether or not it occasionally is or occasionally isn't about the weightiest subject of being. No, he's saying if what you're thinking about actually is your thinking, and if what you're thinking about isn't, or is only something that seems to you and is a matter of mere opinion, then you're confused.
So there's this claim that at least from Parmenides' point of view, that genuine thinking must be tied with truth. Is that sort of the idea?
He's not tying it directly with truth, he's tying it with being, but yes.
Okay.
He's tying it with being, and he's saying that both being and thinking are the same. He's got a notion of same, which they're both conforming to, so to speak. And that same is also winds up being connected with one. But people that connect that with truth specifically, you do get in the later people in that tradition, like Plotinus and the Neoplatonic tradition. They will make that equation, and they'll equate being and truth as being one level in the metaphysical hierarchy, directly below one, or one. They'll put one and good at the top, and they'll put being and truth with an equal sign between them underneath it, and they'll say that thought is what conforms to that being truth equality, and they'll put it a level below that, right? But that's what you get in like Platonian Neoplatonism, right?
And do you read Heidegger as largely taking this over from Parmenides, or do you think that Heidegger may be saying something quite different than what?
I think he's saying something quite different. I think that he's not accepting any of that metaphysical hierarchy. He thinks that that's the example of metaphysics as a attempt to think about being by reifying it, something like that, turning it into an object, even though Parmenides does not think that he's turning it into an object at all, right? Heidegger is not convinced by anything in the Neoplatonic, structure of understanding of being, truth, etc. But that doesn't mean that that structure isn't there, right? It is, and we can explicate it independent of Heidegger's interpretations of them. When Heidegger comes along and interprets those people, you have to understand he is not a Neoplatonist and he is not a Parmenidean, right? He is from outside that tradition and disagrees with that tradition. He does share with them this concern with being, right? But he's understanding that being very differently from them, and being to the folks in that tradition is something closer to a standard of truth that is higher than all appearance, higher than all experience. And for Heidegger, being is something more like that to which intellectual intuition experience makes direct contact, right? There's an experiential element to noetic intuition in Heidegger that puts this direct contact of appearing, announcing to, note on being, and it's not obvious that that's fully there in the people in this Neoplatonic tradition and its Parmenidean precursors, but it is there in the Greeks, and Heidegger is right about that there's a notion of this arising, appearing sense of being in the Greeks that is there before the Parmenideans and so forth, and that is, it's perfectly reasonable to think that that has influenced what they think of as being and how they think about being, and that their notion of nature is behind that. But that's an interpretation on his part, one that he will tell you at the end of this book is a leap, right? He's trying to understand why they would think what they think about this. On the surface of their claims, they are saying that this is true prior to and independent of any experience of their own. They're not trying
Yeah.
to tie it to what they've experienced and explain their experience to you.
Yeah, yeah, and Heidegger maybe even thinks that that's like that might be unthought in what they are in their view.
Yes, he thinks that there's always some experiential ground of what the thinker thinks in some way in which they're responding to the actual events of what has touched them or called upon them. Even if they process that abstractly, there was some original actual underlying historical occurrence that occurred, and if he can divine it out, he can figure out, why they went down whatever path they went down. That's what he's always trying to sleuth out.
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. Dan?
Yeah, I guess the truth here is actually the who's talking to him is aletheia, and aletheia is unconcealment, and unconcealment is to take something as something, and when we do that, we invoke being. We need that being is, and being also is presencing, and when we take something as something, we make it lay down, it's presencing. When we think that, it's presencing. So they are kind of coming together with being as presencing, and that.
Well, that's where it's going to be coming out at the end of this. But let's take a step back for a second and think about how Parmenides views that same set of things you just explained. Yes, all those things are going on when a mortal, on the way of mortals, right, thinks about particular things. And Parmenides has diagnosed what that way is, what its thesis is, how it begins. It begins by thinking that being and not being are the same and not the same. It begins by reducing the question of being to the question of conceptual distinction. The taking something as something is conceptual distinction thinking for Parmenides. He has his own diagnosis of that whole sphere of opinion. And yes, he says that is the way of mortals and all men walk in it, but not because it's the truth. He has a standard of truth that is independent of that way that all men must walk. And he agrees that in that way that all men must walk, people always take something as something. They always understand being and not being is the same and not the same. They're always making conceptual distinctions among things, right? And those conceptual distinctions create the sphere of opinion in which they live. But that whole sphere is, to Parmenides, obviously conventional to the bottom. It's opinion. And you can tell that it's opinion because the notion of being that it is using as its standard is same and not the same. It's purely essential. It's not existential. And it has the same slipperiness between our sphere of essences and actuality that Kant is always on about. But here's Parmenides' take on it. The claim that being is doesn't. Necessary being is different from all that. The truths about necessary being are facts of metaphysics that can be ascertained by the mind, independent of the slipperiness of opinion in all other respects, is the claim. So, I mean, that may be, there's lots of people who disagree with that for all kinds of reasons in the course of the tradition, including Heidegger for his own reasons. But it's not like Parmenides doesn't have his own explanation for where this, taking something as something and sphere of interpretation and all of that sort of historically embodied contingency comes from, or what it is. He thinks that it comes from treating being and not being as a primarily merely conceptual matter. It's just taking being and not being as the same and not the same. Does that make sense? It's not Heidegger's view on it. I understand. It's an alien philosophy. He's trying to understand this alien philosophy in terms of his own, but that alien philosophy has its own compact, maybe too compact, maybe too simplistic explanation of the whole sphere of opinion that Heidegger thinks is just where we all live, always. From Parmenides' points of view, Heidegger is saying mortals live on the way of mortals, period.
Yeah, it's almost like, it seems more like Plato maybe took over that aspect from Parmenides. And yeah, there's definitely,
consciously,
he's definitely anti-Platonic in that sense.
Exactly, and Plato took over from Parmenides the idea that as a mortal, he was going to have to walk in the way of mortals. So he was going to try to make as rationalistically, conceptually reliable as possible the sphere that he acknowledged Parmenides taught him was only the sphere of opinion. You get this especially in the dialogues with the Parmenidean stranger, like Theosophist statesmen, especially Sophist and statesmen, and you know that there's that understanding in Plato that if he's going to make to be is to have a definition, and conceptual definition is his sense of being. And to be is to be intelligible in the sense of having a definition like that. He is consciously moving in the sphere of the many things about which there are separate ideas that are below the level of the Parmenidean one, and that are understood as conceptual distinction with the machinery of same and not the same. Right. So Plato is acknowledging the charge and saying, as a mortal, I choose to walk the way of mortals. Here's how I'm going to try to do it rationally. Right. But because of where he came from, because he came out of that Parmenidean background, he thinks that that world of conceptual stuff he's working with is at best, not best, it's an attempt to find a true world behind a world that he has already accepted for those Parmenidean reasons is a world of mere appearance. Right?
Yeah.
The original division between the world of mere appearance and the possible truth behind the world that you get in Plato as the two worlds stuff is motivated by this Parmenidean difference of the certainty of the truth that being is higher than any of the contingent facts of the realm of seeming, right? And so the fact that he thinks he has a merely apparent world to explain, the fact that he knows that he starts in a cave, is because he's been taught by Parmenides there's a truth outside the cave. There's a truth outside the sphere of opinion that is more reliable than the truth of opinion.
Yeah, and the divided line too mirrors this very closely in the Republic, the cave and the divided line.
Yes, that whole Platonic structure is about this, but it is trying to get this kind of Parmenidean dialectical understanding about things less than being itself.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what the whole Neoplatonic tradition understands itself to be doing. Right. It's what the people like Plotinus, et cetera, think that, yes, this is what Plato did with Parmenides, and yes, we're following in what he did, but by the way, we want to recover all of this ontological truth about the top structure that we had in Parmenides, and all this stuff about the one and all that kind of stuff we're going to rehabilitate. And that's what makes it Neoplatonism, not simply Platonism, is they're trying to keep that Parmenidean core to what they're doing, along with the Platonic stuff about the world of appearances.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's hard enough to understand all this, just the structure of the individual philosophy that Heidegger himself is here reacting to. But the reason I bring it in here is, I mean, when he comes to a passage about being and thinking are the same, and he's right to call that the sentence which sets Western philosophy on its career, so to speak. It helps to know the next steps in that career and why it's a career, right? I mean, and those steps are primarily the Neoplatonic steps. There's also the Aristotle wasn't willing to go that whole way, right? So he has his own direction he goes from it, and maybe logic as we get it in the modern times is invented on that Platonic route, not Platonic, on that Aristotelian route, not the Neoplatonic one. The Hegel he keeps talking about in the last part is definitely still in that Neoplatonic one, right? So if there's two strands that he's reacting to in the modern world, the Hegelian subjectivist system on the one hand, and the logical positivist logistics and technology on the other hand, those two are kind of the further developments of, on the one hand, the Neoplatonic tradition, and on the other the Aristotelian tradition. But those two are the things coming out of this nexus that define those philosophical movements in the modern world, or set their scope or ambition, something like that.
Yeah. That helps a lot to see these different strands that Heidegger is reacting to. It's you really start to see, as you put it, the career. I mean, the way that it develops. That makes a lot of sense.
One of the reasons I try to flesh out these other points of connection, these ways in which there's things that are his imaginary audience objection is a Kant objection that the Platonists wouldn't feel, these sorts of things, and stressing these other ways in which, you know, the no in here is a more Platonic meaning is. I don't think he's always going to bring those things out because he's not sympathetic to some of those schools of thought, right? He's not. It's not what he himself thinks, so he's not going to lay out to you all the ways in which, you know, this thought in Parmenides has this, you know, giant later career in Neoplatonism, right? It's not at the forefront of his mind. He does know it influences all this other stuff in Western philosophy, but tracing all the ways in which Neoplatonism was influenced by this particular line in Parmenides is not what he's about here. He could easily have been. He could have given you a history of that if he knew it, I suppose. A history like that can be written. Let's put it that way.
Sure. Yeah.
Dan?
It seems to me that the Heidegger is kind of not going along these lines like the mortals and the divine. He's going like the beings that are still sustained by the being and those abandoned by the being. Like it's kind of, that's his distinction. And it's kind of, it's not necessarily along this line that went from what you mentioned and Plato and so on, but it's quite a different one.
I agree, and I would say that the Neoplatonic tradition is impressed by the independence of the being is and being from anything like our conceptual thought about it, something like that. And Heidegger is impressed by the fact that oblivion threatens all empirically once actual experiences of the truth of being that are not held in thankful memory and reinstantiated, right? Those are two different concerns about something at stake, right? Or something not at stake. And Heidegger thinks that there's something about the career of being, if by career of being means something like the history of its truth, that doesn't just call for thought from man, but needs something from man, right? And that needs something has to do with this possibility of the fate of oblivion, right? Of forgetfulness, of being forgotten, right? I think it's fair to say that Parmenides was not worried about being forgotten, right? He didn't think that, he thought that the thinker had to respond to the claims of being, and that the risks in the matter were all on the side of the human being who failed to live up to being and therefore doomed himself to incoherence, right? Not that being would be forgotten and therefore not properly responded to or something like that, right? So I agree with you that there's a definite difference in emphasis, and Heidegger is he doesn't have the concerns of a Neoplatonist here at all, right? Because he's first of all, because his standard of truth is much more of this embodied, enacted in time, historical intuition sort of thing. Second, because he thinks that all these things are more historical and contingent than any Parmenidean ever would, right? He thinks that, this career didn't have to go this way and could be, revisited differently if people responded to their experiences differently, right? So he's way more contingent in that regard. He regards this as a freer domain at bottom, whereas the Parmenideans think that there's something necessary, constrained, only one truth in this domain, something like that. But anyway, it's still the case that it is responding to the existence of thoughts on this level that have effects on this scale that is motivating Heidegger to go here and talk about this stuff as where metaphysics is founded, right? This is where the most interesting acts are occurring, and the people performing those most interesting acts that are having the biggest effects, so to speak, don't necessarily agree with him about what they're doing, right? Or what's at stake in what they're doing, but he thinks he sees what's at stake in what they're doing. Okay, so we've gotten through, that's mostly what I want to say on Noah. I want to give other people a chance to say what they want to say on Noah, our third word, because so far we've managed to get to 3 words: Cray, Lagan, and Noah, and that's it. James?
Yeah, would you say that Parmenides is idea of the being is a metaphysics, and the for Heidegger, his interpretation is from the other side, outside of metaphysics, because that's exactly what he's critical of, the tradition of metaphysics that posits this idea of being. But for Heidegger, he arrives at being by way of phenomenology and experience, intuitively and scientifically. So his notion of his interpretation of Parmenides is non-metaphysical.
It's yes, to a degree, but it's curious to have a non-metaphysical interpretation of a thinker who you're going to claim is founding metaphysics. There has to be at least something metaphysical about what Parmenides is doing if he's going to create metaphysics out of it. The sphere of activity exists, right? So, and Heidegger himself is very guarded about how much we can do about any of that besides retrace the steps of its happening and retrace the thoughts that did it, right? It's not clear that Western man is going to do anything less metaphysical than he's done in the past. And if he does, it's only going to be because he understands acts and deeds like those that Parmenides did and created at the first beginning, which is to be, from the standpoint of most people in the street, far more metaphysical than Western man is, these days most of the time, right? In other words, Heidegger's recipe for moving beyond metaphysics is to emulate the most metaphysical thinker in history, right? A curious procedure. Dan?
Yeah, on this topic, and I think relates to what Pete said way back, is like, my understanding is Heidegger is saying every time when we move from beings to being, that's metaphysics. We cannot do that. It's called what he calls beingness. And that's what he started with Plato when we try to generalize from beings what being is, and we came with ideas, and we move on to different with modernity and so on. And for Heidegger, to not to do metaphysics is to start from being and then move from beings, and that's to him. And to do that, we have being there, and then we have the creative thinking.
So okay, but right, it's easy to cast around the notion that the people in the tradition who thought they were thinking about being were in fact reifying being and making it into a single being and making mistakes on that basis. But they didn't think they were making those mistakes, and they thought they were being very careful about not making those mistakes. And they even thought that they are the ones who taught Heidegger and everybody else about which of those things are mistakes and which of those things are not mistakes. So it's not obvious that they're guilty as charged, is what I'm trying to say, right? They don't think that they're reifying being. And some of them might be, some shallow ones among them might be, but it's not clear that the entire tradition is. It's certainly not clear that Parmenides is. When Parmenides is saying that thinking and being are the same, he is not obviously turning being into a single being, right? So that's the first point. The second point is, yes, Heidegger is trying to ground all this, and from his point of view, that's what it really is. Ground all this in something like the evidence of what man's thinking experience has access to. Okay, and if you're talking about what he's doing in terms of grounding things in being in time, even a neo-Kantian, even a logical positivist of his era will recognize those as grounded thoughts. Very few of those people would recognize anything in this as grounded thoughts. They'd call it all metaphysical abstraction, right? And they would think that from the stuff he is studying, he's left grounded 5 exits back, and he's off in the realm of doing metaphysics like the Platonists that he was so critical of in his early years, right? And it's not obvious even that claim is false, right? It's not obvious that they're doing the reifying being thing he claims they are, and it's not obvious that he's not doing metaphysics. It's also not obvious that there's anything wrong with doing metaphysics, even in a very traditional way, especially if you avoid, turning being into one being. So from people outside of either those metaphysical traditions or Heideggerianism, right, they look way more of a piece than you might think. And the difference between them is not the most striking thing about them. The similarities between them is the most striking thing about them. Yeah. So by the way, I'm more sympathetic than Heidegger is to other people in that tradition, and I'm also perfectly sympathetic to Heidegger, probably more sympathetic to Heidegger than most people in that tradition are to Heidegger, right? And I have basically no sympathy for the folks outside who are saying, well, they're all just being metaphysics, and that means they're not making contact with reality, and the only thing that's being reinstantiated here is grammar, and people are being, mystical about grammar or something like that. And so that settles the question, which is what you get from a lot of people outside the tradition. It's, to me, a very, some of the most interesting philosophical debates do occur between those camps, sort of, if I can put it this way, inside the Heideggerian problematic, both in the people he's criticizing and whether or not where his criticisms of them are or not sound. But I am not decided between the two of them remotely, right? It's not at all obvious to me that Heidegger is right in all those criticisms, and the people in the tradition he is criticizing were wrong in all the supposed mistakes they made. He's got a case. I'm very interested in his case. They have a case. That's where I am on it. Just cards on the table. All right, so we managed to get through Cray, Lagan, and Noen. Now we only have 2 words left to do: eon, emmenai, and we'll learn that they're 2 words, but they're really 1 word. Along the way, in the last part, we're going to get his interpretation of the being is, the eon, emmenai, and how that's an instantiation of this duality of being, and we'll also get his interpretation of what he thinks being means to the Greeks. And I want you to keep in mind as you're reading it, is this what being means to the Greeks, all of them, including the fishmonger and the Athenian market, or is this what being means to Parmenides, the philosopher, and is there allowed to be any slippage between them? Is what being means to Homer, what being means to Plato, what being means to Aristotle, what being means to Parmenides, or Heraclitus, are these obviously the same thing? He will make a very strong case, I think a very good case, that being as being present is the native or underlying sense that you get in the Greeks generally, and this, I think he's made his case in the early Greek thinking book that that's there in Heraclitus, and that Heraclitus and himself are very close in their understanding of these things. It's not as clear to me that he's proven that that's true of Parmenides. Besides the understanding of what being means in these people and how far it may extend among Greeks, so to speak, I also want pay some attention to the other history of Western philosophy things he mentions along the way. He'll mention Hegel several times. He'll mention technology several times, and you want to pay attention to which of those things are being praised or condemned or damned with faint praise in various ways in any of this. There's also just a kind of he's trying to do the thing that he's independent of any controversials. He's trying to do the thing he set out to do, to give you an example of thinking, and to give you that example of thinking from the tradition by trying to recover in thankful memory what the experience of at least something like nature or nature in truth was in this period of Greek philosophy. And I think he's reasonably successful in that. And I think it's an impressive accomplishment to span that much difference in philosophical outlook, temperament, as well as that much time, so to speak, to recover that. And as an example of thinking, I think this is great. Do I think that he has, in that interpretation, fully explained or even come close to fully explaining the Parmenides didactic poem and what he meant by saying that being and thinking are the same? I do not. Cards on the table. It's a good interpretation. It's a useful interpretation for understanding the individual terms in the saying, and for understanding this sort of basic experience of being, truth, and nature that you get in the Greek philosophy generally. That's not the same as a critical reading of the didactic poem that understands each of the truth claims that Parmenides is advancing and assesses them fairly and carefully or anything like that, or even assesses their later career and importance. One thinker doesn't have to do everything in every essay, right? I would have wished that he did that too, because I think he'd do a good job of it. But anyway, that's just setting expectations we're going to have in the next part. So timing wise, that's going to be October the 29th. Have our last session on this. The other thing I want to turn to before I just throw it open for general questions is what to do next. I've got a really easy suggestion, considering where we're coming off, which is, do we read his book on the Parmenides? And not on the Parmenides, on Parmenides, just this one. And you know, he gets as far as the intro of the didactic poem. It's not that hard. We could do this reasonably quickly. It's a reasonable follow-up to this subject matter. If we wanted to stay on Heidegger and we wanted a not too challenging next thing to do, the much more ambitious thing, and I'm perfectly open to people saying they want to do this, but they don't want to do it right now. They want to, put it off for more preparation, or whatever. The other one we can do is this little puppy. Contributions to philosophy of the event. This is some of his unpublished writing from the 30s, and in my humble opinion, the densest, hardest to read, and in some ways most interesting Heidegger out there, right? It's certainly not covered as much as some of these other things. If people are up for the challenge, this is something that could take easily 6 months, perhaps a year. It's very challenging, and it's 400 pages basically. But if people are actually up for it, it's the Olympic event in understanding Heidegger. That's what I'm trying to say. So I do want to do it at some point, and I would love to do it with you guys. I think you guys would be great for it, but you got to tell me when, and you got to tell me if you're up for it.
I say go for it. Go for it, Jason. But remember, I'm the one that has not studied philosophy, has no philosophy background, but I say go for it.
Okay.
I'm like equally terrified and fascinated by that book. So I don't even know. It is daunting. It's daunting, that's for sure.
Dan, what would you say to doing contributions to philosophy of the event?
Well, I read both Parmenides and Contribution, and actually I wanted to go back to Contribution. So I think we should jump into that. It doesn't matter how much we prepare. We probably were never ready for it, but we should jump into it. Now is the time.
Well,
I would do it. I would do it with you guys.
Okay, we definitely should jump into it, and like the deep into the pool. You're right that no amount of preparation. That doesn't mean it necessarily has to be starting on November, right? But do come next time with the reactions to it. But Nathan says he's in. I think that the preliminary thought is that we're actually going to try to do this one. I'll have to come up with a lesson plan for it. Yeah, okay, it's out there as possible. Pete.
So there's just a couple of comments. Yeah, I've read both of them too.
Yeah.
One thing with the Parmenides is it's not just Parmenides. There's interesting stuff on Plato and Homer in there.
Yes.
So, it's not like this one where he's just going to take one phrase from Parmenides and spend the whole semester.
Yeah, my impression of this is he took the intro part of getting up to the goddess's door, and then he spent the first half on that, and then he just talked about Styx in the plain of Lethe and river forgetting in the Republic, and meanings of some of these phrases in Homer, and he never quite got back around to the rest of the Parmenides poem.
Yeah, and so my other comment, which is on the contributions, is that we're kind of used to reading Heidegger's lectures where he's trying to educate his students, and the contributions, they're his private notebooks. They're not exactly purely diary. That's more like the black notebooks that were published in the last decade or so. It seems like he actually intended for it to be published at some point after his death.
Yes, I would say this. The parallel thing would be like the will to power notes of Nietzsche is, I think, what he expected for them.
maybe, yeah. But so my thing is, you know, he's working through problems.
Yes.
And, you know, it's Heidegger working through problems. So it's like a level above him lecturing to his students.
Yes. And this is very much
So-
along the lines of what Isabel was saying before, that we write things down in order to be get clarity for thinking about them ourselves. That's what he's doing here. Yeah. And for that reason, it's challenging because, you know, the necessary thoughts to connect each sentence in the paragraph, let alone the paragraph to the next paragraph, is sometimes not on the page, only in his head, and you have to infer it.
Yeah, so I'm up for either, but those are my comments.
Okay. All right. So next time, besides your questions and thoughts on the last part of this, what is called thinking book, and the summary on it, bring any thoughts you have on do or don't do this. And in the meantime, we're going to preliminarily think that we're going to, you know, try to start this sometime in November as our preliminary thought. If people want to look for the book, and definitely you want this particular edition / translation, because earlier translations of it were very hard to read, as people let you know. Okay. Just if people have other thoughts on a wrap up of our question, things I didn't manage to cover in any of my discussion, that you questions about particular passage, anything like that, or general thoughts on our reading.
So just a note, the lecture course, what is called Thinking, there's 11 lectures, I think, in the second semester. And Heidegger used to write down his lectures beforehand, and he actually planned to do 12, but for schedule reasons he couldn't. But he'd written down the 12th, so it's in his complete works. And if you're interested, I put a link in today's meetup to the 12th lecture. If you get to the end of the 11th and you want to read some more.
That's a great idea. Yeah, I'll definitely, thanks. I'll definitely look at that. Thanks. Yep. The amendment is friendly, as they say.
Yeah, I just think I really agreed with you, Jason, when you said that I'm not sure how accurate maybe Heidegger's interpretation of Parmenides is, but it's very productive, if nothing else. And I think it was great when you said too that Parmenides would never have thought of being as something which could be forgotten, and or being as something that requires a place or a site in the way that Heidegger does. And so yeah, it's just so rich. Like I said, I need to go back and read it all again probably, but a lot to it.
All it takes is time.
Yeah.
All right, well, this is great. Thanks for all the questions. Sorry for the minor disruption earlier. I may have to make sure that I edit that when I put this up on YouTube, so it might take a little bit longer to get this one rendered and up. But you know, such is the drama of having things out on the web. All right, no wrap-up thoughts, and we'll stop recording and see you guys next time.
When is the next meeting? October
29th. No, 29th.
Okay.
Sunday, October 29th, same time. Yep.
Yeah, I have an independent question.
Sure.
That's not part of the talk or anything like that. What do you use to translate from Zoom recording to your YouTube channel? What package?
I mean, I just used the native one that renders on my computer, which I barely even know. I'm not using any of this other special stuff. And then for the rest of it, I just use the actual YouTube provided studio tools. So I'm not using a separate piece of software to render it. It's just when I'm done recording, it says, composing / rendering, and then I have it available in my download. So it's not a separate piece of software. Sorry?
It's on PC?
Yes, on a Windows PC. That's right.
Okay, because I've got a leader in another group who's been asked to convert the Zoom presentations to something that he can send out and make available. And he says the only thing he's been able to find is a Mac package, and he can't find anything on a PC. So just
well, they're definitely they're definitely rendered into, you get an audio thing, you get a separate thing for just the video track, you get a few other bits, and I just take the whole video thing, and that's what I upload on YouTube, just using their native tools. So I don't have extra software. I use the intervening steps in that. But fair question.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.